Grizzly bear kills 42-year-old park ranger in 3 minutes. August 12, 2024. The morning of August 12, 2024, began like countless others in the wilderness surrounding Glacier National Park, Montana, with the sun breaking over the jagged peaks of the Continental Divide, casting long shadows across valleys still thick with morning fog. David Michael Collins, 42 years old, father of 2, veteran park ranger with 17 years of service, husband to Margaret Collins for 19 years, woke at 5:15 in the small ranger station near the Many Glacier entrance. His alarm had barely sounded before his hand reached out from under the thin wool blanket to silence it, a practiced motion refined over nearly 2 decades of early mornings. The station was quiet except for the hum of the aging refrigerator in the kitchenette and the distant call of a Clark's nutcracker somewhere in the lodgepole pines that surrounded the weathered wooden structure. David sat up slowly, feeling the familiar tightness in his lower back, a souvenir from a trail accident 3 years prior when he'd slipped on loose scree while responding to a lost hiker report near Grinnell Glacier. He was a compact man, 5'9", 175 pounds, with the wiry build of someone who spent more time hiking steep mountain trails than sitting at a desk. His face was weathered, lined around the eyes and mouth from years of squinting into bright alpine sun and bitter wind, his hair more salt than pepper now, cropped short for convenience. His hands were calloused, scarred from countless encounters with rough bark, sharp stone, and the various tools of his trade. Margaret had called the night before from their home in Kalispell, 45 miles to the southwest, where she worked as a third-grade teacher at Elrod Elementary School. Their daughter Emma, 17, and preparing for her senior year of high school, had been accepted to the University of Montana's Wildlife Biology program with a partial scholarship. News that had filled David with a pride so intense it had brought tears to his eyes when they'd opened the letter together in July. His son, Michael, named after David's father who'd passed away from a heart attack in 2003, was 14 and obsessed with fly fishing, spending every possible moment on the middle fork of the Flathead River with his grandfather's vintage bamboo rod. Margaret had sounded tired on the phone, dealing with the logistics of Emma's impending departure, and Michael's request to attend a fishing camp in Missoula for a week before school started. "When are you coming home?" she'd asked, and he'd heard the slight edge in her voice that told him she was lonely, that the house felt too quiet without him, that she worried more than she let on about his work in the backcountry. "Day after tomorrow," he'd promised. "I'm just covering for Hanson while he's dealing with that family emergency. 2 more days of inspections. Then I'm all yours for the weekend. I'm thinking we could drive up to Polebridge. Get those huckleberry bear claws from the Mercantile that you love." She'd laughed then, that warm sound that still made his chest tighten with affection after nearly 2 decades together, and said, "You're bribing me with pastries now." "Whatever works," he'd replied, grinning into the phone, even though she couldn't see him. David moved through his morning routine with practiced efficiency. He heated water on the propane stove for instant coffee, ate 2 granola bars and an apple while reviewing his notes from the previous day, and studied the topographic maps spread across the small wooden table that served as both desk and dining surface. His assignment for the day was straightforward, at least on paper: inspect the Patomagon Falls trail system and investigate reports of a collapsed campsite at the remote Patomagon Lake Site No. 7, located approximately 8 miles from the Many Glacier trailhead. The report had come in 2 days earlier from backpackers who'd hiked past the site and noticed a tent that appeared to have been damaged, possibly by weather, or more concerning, by wildlife. The backpackers, a couple in their 30s from Seattle named Joshua and Amanda Reeves, had documented the scene with photographs on their smartphone, images that David had reviewed carefully. The tent, a bright orange 3-person dome design, was partially collapsed, with what appeared to be significant tearing visible on one side. Camping gear was scattered around the site, including what looked like a sleeping bag, cooking equipment, and a backpack. Most concerning was that there was no sign of the tent's occupants, and the Reeveses had reported an unsettling stillness to the scene, a quality they struggled to articulate, but that had prompted them to hike out quickly and file a report rather than investigate further themselves. The report had initially generated significant concern at park headquarters, raising fears of a potential missing persons situation or wildlife attack. However, follow-up investigation had revealed that the tent belonged to Marcus Whitfield, a 36-year-old software engineer from Portland, Oregon, who had been backpacking alone in the area but had already checked out of the backcountry and driven home safely 4 days earlier. Whitfield had confirmed via phone that he'd experienced severe weather during his trip, with high winds that had damaged his tent during the night of August 7th, forcing him to cut his trip short and hike out the following morning. He'd been embarrassed about leaving debris at the site, explaining that the wind had scattered his gear and that he'd done his best to collect everything, but admitted he might have missed some items in his haste to escape the deteriorating conditions. Still, park protocol required an official inspection and cleanup of the site, which fell under David's current responsibilities. It was routine work, the kind of task that filled much of a ranger's actual day-to-day existence, far removed from the dramatic search and rescue operations or wildlife encounters that dominated public perception of the job. David dressed in layers, starting with a moisture-wicking base layer, then his standard-issue National Park Service shirt in the familiar grey-green, followed by his lightweight hiking pants with reinforced knees and multiple pockets for storing the various items he might need throughout the day. He laced up his Danner Mountain light boots, 8-year-old companions that had been resoled twice and were molded perfectly to his feet. His duty belt held his radio, a can of bear spray in a quick-release holster on his right hip, a multi-tool, and a small first aid kit. He filled his Camelback hydration pack with 3 liters of water, checked that his satellite communicator was fully charged and functioning, and loaded his backpack with additional supplies: emergency shelter, extra food, a comprehensive first aid kit, rope, knife, fire-starting materials, GPS unit, and his weathered field notebook where he documented observations in his cramped but meticulous handwriting. The bear spray was a relatively new addition to his standard gear, mandated by park policy only in the last 5 years after a series of increasingly frequent human-bear encounters throughout the greater Yellowstone ecosystem. David had mixed feelings about carrying it. He'd never had to deploy it in 17 years, had instead relied on his knowledge of bear behavior, proper food storage protocols, and making noise while hiking to avoid surprise encounters. But he understood the reasoning behind the policy and wore it without complaint. At 6:30, David contacted dispatch via radio to log his itinerary for the day. The voice that crackled back belonged to Sarah Chen, 31 years old, a communications specialist who'd transferred to Glacier from Yosemite the previous summer and was working the day shift out of the headquarters building in West Glacier. "Morning, David," she said, her voice warm but professional. "You heading up to ptarmigan?" "That's affirmative," David replied, his thumb pressed against the transmit button on the handheld radio. "Inspecting the collapsed tent site at number 7, then checking the general condition of the trail system. Should be back at the station by 1700 hours, maybe earlier depending on conditions." "Weather's supposed to be clear today, high around 76, but there's a front moving in tonight," Sarah said. "Rangers reported fresh bear scat on the Iceberg Lake Trail yesterday, so keep your eyes open." "Always do," David said. "I'll check in at the regular intervals." "Copy that. Be safe out there." The radio clicked off, leaving David alone with the morning sounds of the forest awakening around him. He stepped outside into air that was crisp and cool, probably around 50 degrees, carrying the scent of pine and the earthy smell of the forest floor after several days of intermittent rain. The sky was a deep blue, cloudless, with visibility that extended for miles across the dramatic landscape of saw-toothed peaks, glacial valleys, and alpine meadows that defined this corner of northwest Montana. Glacier National Park, established in 1910, encompassed over 1 million acres of protected wilderness straddling the Continental Divide, home to over 70 species of mammals, including approximately 300 grizzly bears, animals that had once ranged across most of western North America but were now confined to isolated pockets of habitat in the northern Rockies and Alaska. The grizzly, Ursus arctos horribilis, was a subspecies of brown bear, distinguished by its dished facial profile, prominent shoulder hump, and long, slightly curved claws adapted for digging. Adult males could weigh anywhere from 400 to 800 pounds, with exceptional individuals exceeding 900, while females typically ranged from 250 to 400 pounds. They were omnivorous opportunists with a diet that varied seasonally, consuming roots, berries, nuts, insects, fish, and carrion, along with occasional predation on ungulates, particularly elk and deer calves in spring. In the glacier ecosystem, grizzlies emerged from winter dens sometime between late March and early May, depending on elevation and snow conditions, and spent the summer and fall in a state of hyperphagia, consuming massive quantities of food to build fat reserves for the next winter's hibernation. David had encountered grizzlies dozens of times during his career, almost always at a distance, the bears moving through meadows or along ridgelines, occasionally glimpsed as dark shapes in the thick brush that choked the valleys. He'd learned to read their body language, to distinguish the casual foraging behavior of a relaxed bear from the stiff-legged gait and laid-back ears that signaled agitation or potential aggression. He'd watched mothers with cubs from safe distances, marveling at the tenderness with which these powerful animals interacted with their offspring, and he'd seen the devastating efficiency with which a grizzly could tear apart a rotting log in search of insects, claws ripping through wood like it was paper. He respected them deeply, these remnants of the megafauna that had once dominated the landscape, and he understood that sharing their habitat required constant vigilance, awareness, and a healthy respect for their power and unpredictability. Most encounters ended peacefully, with the bear catching human scent and quickly moving away, as eager to avoid contact as the humans were. But occasionally, circumstances aligned in dangerous ways. A bear defending a food cache, a mother protecting cubs, a startled animal responding to a surprise encounter at close range, or, most dangerous of all, a bear that had lost its natural wariness of humans through habituation or food conditioning. The drive from the ranger station to the Many Glacier trailhead took 40 minutes along narrow roads that wound through dense forest and opened occasionally to stunning views of mountain peaks reflecting in glacial lakes. David saw several elk grazing in a meadow near the road, a small herd of mule deer, and a golden eagle perched in a skeletal snag that rose above the surrounding forest. He parked his government-issued white Chevy truck in the trailhead lot at 7:20, noting 3 other vehicles already present, backpackers getting an early start on what promised to be a beautiful day. He recognized one of the trucks as belonging to Thomas and Linda Bradshaw, a couple in their late 50s from Bozeman who were experienced backcountry campers and whom David had encountered multiple times over the years. The other vehicles were a blue Honda CR-V with Washington plates and a dusty gray Subaru Outback registered in Colorado. David made quick notes of the license plates and vehicle descriptions in his field book, standard procedure for tracking backcountry use and maintaining a record of who might be in the area in case of emergency. The trailhead register showed that 6 groups had signed in over the past 24 hours, totaling 14 people heading into various destinations throughout the trail system. David added his own entry, noting his destination, expected return time, and the current date and time. The register was a simple weatherproof box containing a spiral notebook, pen on a chain, and informational materials about bear safety, leave no trace principles, and current trail conditions. A wooden information board displayed a large topographic map of the area with trails marked in different colors according to difficulty, along with posted warnings about recent wildlife sightings and trail closures. David paused to read the most recent updates. A bull moose had been frequenting the trail around Grinnell Lake and had shown aggressive behavior toward hikers on 3 occasions in the past week. Warning signs were posted. A section of the Piegan Pass Trail was temporarily closed for maintenance. Grizzly activity was reported as high throughout the region due to an excellent berry crop this summer. David had seen the bushes heavy with fruit during his patrols, the huckleberries especially abundant, which generally meant well-fed, less desperate bears, though it also meant bears were ranging widely through their territories to take advantage of the distributed food sources. The trail began gently, winding through a forest of Engelmann spruce and subalpine fir, the path well-maintained and obvious, marked by cairns and occasional blazes on trees where the route might otherwise be ambiguous. The morning light filtered through the canopy in slanting beams, illuminating patches of undergrowth, thick with ferns and wildflowers that were just beginning to fade as summer slowly gave way toward autumn. David fell into the rhythmic pace of an experienced hiker, his breathing steady, his movements efficient, avoiding unnecessary energy expenditure. He made noise as he walked, occasionally calling out, "Hey, bear!" or clapping his hands, standard practice to avoid surprising wildlife. His eyes constantly scanned his surroundings, noting details that most casual hikers would miss. Fresh deer tracks in a muddy section of trail, claw marks on an aspen trunk where a bear had climbed years ago, and the scars had grown into distinctive parallel grooves. The skull of a small mammal, possibly a marmot, cleaned white by weather and scavengers. These details were the language of the forest, telling stories of predation, survival, territorial disputes, and the endless cycle of life and death that played out beyond human observation. After approximately 2 miles, the trail began to climb more steeply, switchbacking up the side of a ridge that separated the Many Glacier Valley from the ptarmigan drainage. David's pace slowed as the grade increased, his breathing becoming slightly labored but still controlled. Sweat dampened his shirt beneath his pack, despite the cool morning air. He paused at a switchback to drink from his hydration pack and looked back at the view opening behind him, miles of pristine wilderness stretching toward the eastern plains. The dramatic face of Mount Wilbur dominating the skyline to the southwest, its glaciers gleaming white against dark rock. A mountain goat observed him from a rocky outcrop 50 yards above the trail, its white coat brilliant in the morning sun, completely unconcerned by his presence. David raised his camera and took several photographs, documenting the encounter in the same way he documented everything on the trail, building a record of observations that contributed to the park's wildlife monitoring programs. At the crest of the ridge, approximately 4 miles from the trailhead, the trail leveled out and entered a different ecological zone, the forest opening into alpine meadows, interspersed with clusters of stunted trees shaped by wind and winter snow. Wildflowers carpeted the ground in patches of yellow, purple, and white, arnica, lupine, Indian paintbrush, and numerous species David could identify from years of observation and reference to field guides. The views here were spectacular in all directions, 360-degree vistas of peaks, valleys, and the distant suggestion of plains far to the east. David paused for 10 minutes, ostensibly to rest and eat an energy bar, but mostly to simply absorb the beauty of the landscape, a privilege of his profession that he never took for granted. He thought about Emma and how she'd loved hiking these trails with him when she was younger, before the teenage years had brought different interests and the social dynamics that pulled young people away from family activities. He wondered if she'd return to these mountains after college, if the pull of the wilderness would prove as strong for her as it had for him, or if she'd follow her own path to different landscapes and experiences. The radio on his belt squawked. "Ranger Collins, this is dispatch. Scheduled check-in." David unclipped the radio and pressed the transmit button. "This is Collins. I'm approximately 4 miles in, just cresting the ridge into the ptarmigan drainage. All clear so far, no issues to report." "Copy that, David. Your next check-in is at 1200 hours. Affirmative. Collins out." The radio clicked back to standby mode, and David continued hiking, now descending gradually into the ptarmigan Valley. The trail here was less maintained, narrower, with sections overgrown by brush that forced him to push through branches that left small scratches on his arms and deposited water from the previous night's rain onto his clothing. The vegetation was thick, creating limited sight lines, exactly the kind of terrain where surprise bear encounters were most likely. David increased his noise-making, calling out every few minutes, clapping his hands, even singing snatches of songs in his off-key voice that Margaret teased him about mercilessly. He encountered fresh bear scat on the trail, approximately 5 miles in, a substantial pile that steamed slightly in the cool air, indicating it was very recent, possibly within the past hour. David knelt to examine it without touching, noting its composition: partially digested berries, seeds, and what appeared to be insect parts, consistent with a bear's omnivorous late-summer diet. The scat was large, suggesting a full-grown bear, possibly male given the size. David photographed it for documentation, then marked the location on his GPS. He looked around carefully, scanning the surrounding forest and meadows for any sign of the bear, but saw nothing. The forest was quiet, except for the sound of wind moving through the trees and the distant call of a raven. David continued forward, his awareness heightened, his right hand moving unconsciously to touch the bear spray holstered at his hip, verifying its presence and ready accessibility. Ptarmigan Lake appeared suddenly as the trail rounded a bend and descended through a final stretch of forest. It was a classic alpine lake, roughly circular, maybe a quarter-mile across, surrounded by steep slopes and rocky cliffs that rose toward the peaks above. The water was a deep blue-green, incredibly clear, the bottom visible in the shallows near the shore where rounded stones created a natural beach. Several designated campsites ringed the lake, marked by weathered wooden posts with numbers carved into them and surrounded by cleared areas where previous campers had set up tents. David could see 2 sites currently occupied, tents visible in the distance, but no sign of people, presumably still sleeping or perhaps out hiking to surrounding peaks. Site number 7 was on the far side of the lake, requiring another mile of walking around the shoreline on a narrow trail that was often muddy and required careful foot placement to avoid twisting an ankle on hidden rocks. The sun was higher now, warming the air, burning off the morning chill. David estimated the temperature had risen into the mid-60s, comfortable hiking weather. He checked his watch, 9:45. He was making good time ahead of schedule, which meant he'd have plenty of time to inspect the site, do some cleanup if necessary, and still make it back to the trailhead with time to spare before his next scheduled check-in with dispatch. He passed one of the occupied campsites where an elderly couple was just emerging from their tent, moving with the stiffness of people who'd spent the night on the ground. David raised his hand in greeting, and they waved back, calling out a friendly, "Good morning, Ranger." He stopped briefly to chat, learning that they were Roger and Patricia Simmons from Minnesota, celebrating their 40th wedding anniversary with a backpacking trip, something they'd done regularly in their younger years but hadn't attempted in over a decade. "It's harder than I remembered," Roger said with a rueful laugh, rubbing his lower back, "but worth every ache." Patricia nodded agreement, her face radiant despite obvious fatigue. David congratulated them, checked that they had proper permits and bear canisters for their food, offered a few reminders about leave-no-trace principles, and continued on his way, feeling a warmth in his chest at their evident affection for each other and for the wilderness. Site number 7 came into view at 10:15. The scene was much as the photographs had depicted. An orange dome tent partially collapsed, one side caved in, and the fabric showing several tiers. Camping gear was scattered around the site, though not as extensively as the Reeves' report had suggested. David could see a sleeping bag, a cooking pot, a stuff sack that appeared to contain clothing, and various smaller items half hidden in the grass. The ground around the tent was churned up, evidence of the high winds that Whitfield had described. Several tent stakes had pulled completely free, and the guy lines were tangled. David began a systematic inspection of the site, taking photographs from multiple angles, documenting everything for his report. He picked up the scattered gear, checking each item for damage and determining what could be salvaged and what would need to be packed out as garbage. The sleeping bag was muddy, but otherwise intact. The cooking pot had a significant dent. The stuff sack revealed several articles of clothing, also muddy but undamaged. As David worked, he noticed other details that seemed inconsistent with a simple weather event. Some of the tiers in the tent fabric looked less like wind damage and more like they'd been caused by something sharp pulling at the material. The pattern wasn't consistent with branches or debris impacting the tent, but rather suggested something had grabbed at the fabric and ripped it. David felt the first stirrings of unease. He circled the campsite, examining the ground more carefully. The churned earth he'd initially attributed to wind now looked different to his experienced eye. There were marks in the soft soil that could be claw impressions, though they were indistinct enough that he couldn't be certain. Near the collapsed tent, he found what was unmistakably a paw print, a single clear impression in a patch of mud near the tent's entrance. David knelt beside it, his pulse quickening. It was large, approximately 6 inches across at its widest point, with visible claw marks extending another 2 inches beyond the pad. Grisly, and a big one. David photographed the print from multiple angles, placing his hand beside it for scale, noting its depth and the fact that it was oriented toward the tent. He searched for more prints but found nothing definitive, the rocky and grass-covered ground not conducive to preserving tracks. Standing slowly, David reassessed the scene with this new information. A grizzly had been at this campsite, possibly investigating it after the occupant had left, or, more concerningly, possibly involved in the events that had damaged the tent while Whitfield was still there. But Whitfield had made no mention of a bear encounter when he'd been contacted by park officials. David made a mental note to follow up with more detailed questions about exactly what had happened at the site. The unease David felt intensified as he noticed something else. Marks on a nearby tree, approximately 7 feet up the trunk, where bark had been stripped away in long parallel gouges, fresh marks, the exposed wood still pale and oozing sap. A bear had stood on its hind legs and clawed this tree recently, probably within the past day or two. David knew that bears marked trees for various reasons, to communicate with other bears, to scratch an itch, sometimes seemingly just for the satisfaction of the activity. But the height of these marks suggested a very large bear, and their freshness suggested the animal was currently active in this immediate area. David's training and experience told him that he should document the scene and then leave the area promptly. There was nothing in his job description that required him to remain in a location where a large grizzly was clearly spending time. He could complete his report, recommend that the site be temporarily closed, and return with additional personnel if further investigation was deemed necessary. But David was also thorough, perhaps to a fault, a quality that Margaret sometimes described as stubbornness. He wanted to complete a proper clean-up of the site, to remove all the scattered gear and debris, to leave the area in better condition than he'd found it. It would only take another 30 or 40 minutes, and he was making plenty of noise, which should keep any bears in the area at a distance. He'd never had a problem in 17 years. He was carrying bear spray. He was prepared. These thoughts ran through his mind in the space of a few seconds, a rationalization process that would later be scrutinized in official reports and informal discussions, people wondering what had driven his decision to remain at the site despite the clear evidence of recent bear activity. The truth was simpler and more mundane than any dramatic explanation. He was doing his job, and his job sometimes required working in proximity to wildlife, and he'd always managed that risk successfully before. David spent the next 20 minutes methodically collecting debris, stuffing items into a large garbage bag he'd brought for this purpose. He collapsed the tent as much as possible, given its damaged condition, rolling it into a bundle that he secured with cord. He picked up scattered tent stakes, found a water bottle half buried in grass, collected several energy bar wrappers that Whitfield had apparently missed. As he worked, David maintained his noise discipline, singing songs, calling out periodically, banging his cooking pot against a rock. The morning continued to warm, the sun now high enough that it beat down on the open area around the campsite. David took another drink from his hydration pack and decided he'd take a short break before making the trek back around the lake. He sat on a flat rock near the shore, pulled out a sandwich he'd packed, and simply took in the beauty of the location. Ptarmigan Lake was stunning, the water perfectly still, reflecting the surrounding peaks like a mirror. A family of common mergansers swam past, the ducklings following their mother in a perfect line. A marmot whistled from somewhere among the rocks above the lake. It was 11:45. In 15 minutes, he'd need to make his scheduled radio check-in with dispatch. David decided he'd make the call from here, tell Sarah he was wrapping up at the site and would be starting the return hike shortly. He leaned back against the rock, feeling the sun on his face, thinking about the weekend ahead with Margaret and the kids, planning the drive up to Polebridge. Maybe they could stop at the ranger station there and see some of his former colleagues. His mind drifted, relaxing for the first time since he'd woken that morning, the accumulated fatigue from days of hard hiking catching up with him in this moment of stillness. This was a mistake. The most fundamental rule of bear country was to remain constantly aware of your surroundings, to never let your guard down, to never assume you were alone in the wilderness. David had let himself relax, had allowed the peaceful setting and the successful completion of his task to lull him into complacency. It was a mistake that would cost him dearly. The bear had been watching from the forest edge, approximately 150 yards from the campsite, for the past 30 minutes, since shortly after David had arrived. It was a male grizzly, age estimated at 12 years old, weighing approximately 700 pounds, a massive animal in his prime. He had been born in the spring of 2012, one of 3 cubs to a mother who ranged through the ptarmigan drainage and had successfully raised 2 previous litters. He had separated from his mother in his 3rd year, as was natural for male grizzlies, and had established his own territory, overlapping parts of his mother's range and extending into adjacent valleys. He was not habituated to humans in the sense of seeking them out or associating them with food rewards, but he was also not naive about human presence in his territory. He had encountered hikers many times, usually at a distance, and his typical response was to avoid them, moving away into denser cover or circling around to maintain distance while continuing to his destination. He had never attacked a human, had never shown aggressive behavior toward people, had never been involved in any incident that would have flagged him to wildlife managers as a problem bear. But on this particular morning, the bear was in a state of heightened agitation due to a confluence of factors that wildlife biologists would later attempt to piece together. First, he was in the late stages of hyperphagia, that period of intense feeding before hibernation, and his behavior was driven by powerful biological imperatives to consume calories. Second, he had recently lost a food cache, a dead elk calf he had buried near the lake's outlet stream, to a pack of wolves that had moved through the area 2 nights earlier. The loss of this significant food source had increased his stress levels and made him more reactive and defensive about potential food opportunities. Third, and perhaps most significantly, the bear had found the remains of the Simmons's campsite from the previous evening, specifically some food scraps that had been improperly stored and that the bear had consumed. This had created a positive association between human camping areas and food rewards, a conditioning process that could develop alarmingly quickly in bears. The bear had then moved around the lake, investigating other campsites, and had found Whitfield's abandoned site number 7, where he'd torn into the tent looking for food. Finding nothing of value, he'd moved into the forest to rest and digest his modest meal, but he'd remained in the immediate area, his territory after all, aware of the lake and its surroundings. When David had arrived at the site, the bear had become immediately alert, watching from his resting place in a dense thicket of willows. The bear's response to David's presence was initially neutral, simply observational, the animal curious but not threatened or interested in interaction. If David had completed his work quickly and left, the encounter would likely have ended with no contact, the bear waiting until the human left and then possibly returning to investigate the site again. But as David had lingered, and particularly as he'd sat down to rest and eat his sandwich, the bear's interest had intensified. The smell of food, even the modest sandwich David was eating, carried on the light breeze directly toward the bear's position. The bear's nose was extraordinarily sensitive, capable of detecting scents from miles away, and the smell of human food triggered responses in the bear's brain, associations newly formed from his consumption of the Simmons's food scraps. The bear rose to his feet and began moving slowly toward the campsite, using the terrain and vegetation for cover, approaching in a way that suggested stalking behavior rather than the defensive charge of a surprised or threatened animal. David finished his sandwich at 11:50, stood up, and reached for the radio on his belt. He was facing the lake, his back to the forest edge, completely unaware of the 700-pound predator that was now less than 70 yards away and moving steadily closer. David pressed the transmit button on his radio and began to speak. "Dispatch, this is Ranger Collins, checking in as scheduled. I'm at Ptarmigan Lake, site number 7, just wrapping up the inspection. I've documented significant bear activity at the site, and I'm recommending—" He never finished the sentence. Some instinct, some ancient awareness bred into humans from millennia of being prey to large predators, caused him to pause mid-word and turn his head slightly. In his peripheral vision, he caught movement, something large and dark emerging from the forest edge, moving rapidly directly toward him. Time seemed to slow, that subjective distortion that occurs during moments of extreme stress when the brain's processing speed increases and events that take only seconds feel elongated, every detail hyper-focused. David's mind registered several observations simultaneously. The massive size of the approaching animal, the speed with which it was covering ground, the fixed focus of its attention on him, the fact that it was not making any noise or displaying any of the bluff charge behaviors he'd been trained to recognize. David's training kicked in, the countless hours of instruction, drills, and mental preparation for this exact scenario. His hand dropped the radio and moved to his hip, fingers finding the quick-release holster that held his bear spray. The canister came free smoothly, David's muscle memory functioning despite the surge of adrenaline that made his hands shake. He pivoted to face the charging bear, raising the canister, his thumb finding the trigger. The bear was 40 yards away, 30, closing with terrifying speed, its massive body moving with an agility that seemed impossible for an animal so large. David's mind screamed at him to run, a primal impulse that he fought down with conscious effort, knowing that running would only trigger the bear's chase instinct, and that he could never outrun a grizzly that could hit speeds of 35 miles per hour in short bursts. 20 yards, 15. David pressed the trigger on the bear spray canister, felt it activate in his hand, saw the orange cloud of capsaicin-based spray shoot out ahead of him. But the wind, that gentle breeze that had been blowing all morning, carried the spray at an angle, not directly into the bear's path. The bear barely slowed, ploughing through the edge of the spray cloud, its eyes and nose receiving only a fraction of the deterrent that would have been necessary to stop the charge. The impact when the bear hit David was like being struck by a vehicle, 700 pounds of muscle and bone traveling at 30 miles per hour, the collision generating forces that the human body was never designed to withstand. David was lifted off his feet and thrown backward, landing on the rocky ground with an impact that drove the air from his lungs and sent bolts of pain through his back and shoulders. The bear was on him instantly, its weight crushing him against the ground, and David felt teeth close on his left shoulder, felt them puncture through the fabric of his uniform shirt, through skin and muscle, grinding against bone. The pain was beyond anything David had experienced, white-hot and all-consuming, and he heard himself scream, a sound of pure animal agony that echoed across the lake. The radio lay several feet away where it had fallen, Sarah Chen's voice crackling from it. "David! David, you're cutting out. Please repeat your last transmission." "David!" David's mind fragmented, split between the overwhelming pain and terror, and some small part of his consciousness that remained analytical, observing. The ranger who had spent 17 years learning about bear behavior, now experiencing it firsthand in the most horrifying way possible. The bear was not feeding, was not exhibiting the methodical tearing and consuming behavior of a predatory attack. Instead, it was mauling him, shaking its head violently with his shoulder still clenched in its jaws, throwing him back and forth like a terrier shaking a rat. David's body was ragdoll limp, his nervous system overwhelmed by trauma, unable to mount any effective resistance. He felt ribs crack under the weight of the bear's paws, felt claws tear through his clothing and flesh, felt blood, hot and wet, soaking his shirt. The bear released his shoulder and bit down on his head, its jaws wide enough to encompass David's skull, teeth puncturing his scalp, scraping bone. David's vision went red, then black, consciousness flickering as his brain struggled to process the catastrophic damage his body was receiving. The attack had already lasted approximately 60 seconds when Roger Simmons, drawn by David's scream, appeared on the trail around the lake. Roger was still a quarter-mile away, but he had a clear line of sight across the water to site number 7, and what he saw froze him in his tracks. The bear, massive and unmistakable, was on top of the ranger, mauling him with savage intensity. Patricia came up behind her husband and saw the scene, her hand flying to her mouth, a strangled gasp escaping her throat. Roger's mind raced. He had hiked in Alaska, had taken a wilderness safety course that covered bear encounters, and he knew with absolute certainty that there was nothing he could do to help the ranger from this distance. Charging toward the bear would accomplish nothing except possibly getting himself killed. But he had to do something. He grabbed his trekking pole and began banging it against a rock, creating a loud metallic ringing sound, shouting at the top of his lungs, "Hey! Hey, bear! Get away! Hey!" The noise carried across the lake, and the bear's head snapped up, its eyes fixing on this new threat. For a moment everything stopped, a frozen tableau of predator, prey, and distant witnesses. Then the bear looked back down at David, opened its jaws, and delivered one final, devastating bite to David's torso, teeth sinking deep into his chest and abdomen. Then the bear turned and loped back toward the forest, disappearing into the willows without a sound. The entire attack, from the moment the bear emerged from the forest to its disappearance back into cover, had lasted approximately 3 minutes. David lay motionless on the ground, his body twisted at unnatural angles, surrounded by a growing pool of blood that seeped into the rocky soil. His uniform was shredded, hanging in tatters, the grey-green fabric stained dark red. His face was barely recognizable, swollen and torn, blood obscuring his features. Roger stood frozen for perhaps 5 seconds, his mind struggling to process what he'd just witnessed. Then training and basic human decency took over. "Patricia, give me your phone and then stay here," he commanded, already moving, running along the trail toward the site, despite his 62-year-old body's protests and the very real possibility that the bear might return. Patricia fumbled in her pack, found their satellite phone, the emergency device they'd brought specifically for situations like this, and handed it to Roger with shaking hands. "Call 911, tell them we have a ranger down with massive injuries from a bear attack at Ptarmigan Lake. We need immediate emergency response," Roger shouted over his shoulder, already disappearing down the trail. Patricia's hands shook so badly she could barely operate the phone's buttons. It took 3 attempts to power it on. Then she had to wait agonizing seconds for it to acquire satellite signal. The phone finally connected, and she pressed the emergency call button, was routed through an automated system to the 911 dispatch center in Flathead County. "911, what is your emergency?" The dispatcher's voice was calm, professional, trained to handle crisis. "There's a ranger. He's been attacked by a bear, massive injuries. We're at Ptarmigan Lake in Glacier National Park. We need help immediately." Patricia's voice broke on the last words, tears streaming down her face. "Ma'am, I need you to stay calm and give me specific information. Where exactly is Ptarmigan Lake?" The dispatcher was already typing, pulling up maps, initiating emergency response protocols. "It's in the Many Glacier area, about 8 miles from the trailhead. We're at campsite number 7. The ranger is badly hurt. There's so much blood, oh God!" Patricia's voice dissolved into sobs. The dispatcher's voice cut through her panic. "Ma'am, I need you to focus. Is the bear still there? Are you in danger?" No, my husband scared it off. It ran back into the forest. But the ranger, he's not moving, I don't think." "Is your husband with the ranger now?" "He's running to him. He should be there any second." "Okay, I have emergency response being dispatched. Do you have any medical training?" "No, just basic first aid." "Okay, here's what I need you to do. Stay on the line with me. Once your husband reaches the ranger, I need you to relay information to me about the victim's condition." Roger reached David at 11:54 a.m., dropping to his knees beside the broken body of the ranger. His initial assessment was devastating. David's injuries were catastrophic, the kind of trauma that Roger, who had worked 30 years as an industrial safety manager before retirement and had seen his share of serious accidents, recognized as likely unsurvivable. David's breathing was rapid and shallow, a wet rattling sound that indicated blood in his lungs. His face was destroyed, features obscured by trauma and blood. His left shoulder was mangled, the arm attached but barely functional. His torso showed multiple deep lacerations and puncture wounds, including a massive wound to his abdomen, where intestines were visible through torn tissue. Roger fought down the wave of nausea and horror that threatened to paralyze him and began to apply what first aid he could. He grabbed David's pack, found the first aid kit, ripped it open, and pulled out trauma dressings. He pressed them against the worst of the wounds, particularly the abdominal injury, applying pressure even as blood soaked through the bandages almost immediately. David's eyes fluttered open briefly, unfocused, rolling back. His lips moved, trying to speak, but only blood bubbled out. Roger leaned close. "Stay with me, David. "Help is coming. You're going to be okay." Even as he said the words, Roger knew they were likely lies, but what else could he say to a dying man? The radio, lying several feet away, continued to crackle with Sarah Chen's increasingly worried transmissions. "David, please respond. David, are you there? I'm showing your last position at Ptarmigan Lake. David, if you can hear me, please key your radio twice." Sarah was following protocol for a ranger who had missed a check-in, trying to establish contact, already considering whether to escalate to emergency protocols. She'd heard David's transmission cut off mid-sentence, had heard something in the background that might have been a shout or scream, but the audio had been distorted and unclear. She'd tried reaching him 3 times in the past 2 minutes with no response, which was unusual enough to be concerning. Sarah pulled up the park's incident response procedures on her computer, reviewing the steps for a potential ranger emergency. At the same time, the 911 call from Patricia Simmons was being routed to park dispatch, connecting Sarah with the Flathead County dispatcher and the chaotic story of a ranger down with bear attack injuries. "I need confirmation of location," Sarah said, her voice sharp, professional despite the ice forming in her chest. Patricia, still on the line with the county dispatcher, relayed the information. Sarah's fingers flew across her keyboard, pulling up David's itinerary, confirming his planned location at Ptarmigan Lake. "Initiating emergency response," Sarah said. "We have a ranger down with reported bear attack injuries at Ptarmigan Lake, site number 7, 8 miles from Many Glacier Trailhead. I'm activating the SAR team and requesting air support from Kalispell." Within 90 seconds, Sarah had triggered a massive emergency response that would involve multiple agencies and dozens of personnel. The first alert went to the park's search and rescue coordinator, Michael Torres, 48 years old, a former paramedic and current supervisory ranger who coordinated all emergency response operations for the Many Glacier district. Torres was at his desk in park headquarters when his phone rang, Sarah's voice tense. "Mike, we have a ranger down. Bear attack. Ptarmigan Lake. It's David Collins." Torres felt his stomach drop. He'd known David for 12 years, had worked with him on dozens of rescues and incidents, considered him a friend. "How bad?" Torres asked, already grabbing his gear, his mind running through logistics. "Unknown, but witnesses report massive injuries. We need air support and ground teams, and we need them now." "I'm activating the team. Get me the Montana DHART helicopter from Kalispell. Contact 2 Bear Air Rescuers backup, and I want every available ranger and SAR volunteer mobilized to stage at the Many Glacier Trailhead. I'll coordinate from there." Torres hung up and began making calls, triggering the emergency response cascade that would bring helicopters, paramedics, rangers and volunteers racing toward Ptarmigan Lake. The Discover Helicopter Emergency Medical Service, DART helicopter based in Kalispell, received the emergency call at 12:02 p.m. The pilot, Captain James Reynolds, 51 years old with over 8,000 hours of mountain flying experience, and his crew, flight nurse Melissa Parker and flight paramedic Josh Denning, were already moving toward the helicopter before they'd finished receiving the briefing. "Bear attack. Glacier National Park, Ptarmigan Lake, adult male with severe trauma, unknown exact status," the dispatcher relayed. "Weather conditions are clear, winds calm, you have clearance for direct flight." Reynolds was spooling up the engines before the transmission ended, running through pre-flight checks with the practice speed of someone who had done this thousands of times. The helicopter, a Bell 407, specially equipped for mountain rescue operations with enhanced power and advanced navigation systems, lifted off at 12:07 p.m., banking immediately toward the northeast and Glacier National Park. Flight time to Ptarmigan Lake was estimated at 18 minutes. In the cabin, Parker and Denning were preparing medical equipment, pulling out trauma supplies, blood products, advanced airway equipment, preparing for what they all knew would be a desperate situation. Bear attack victims rarely survived if injuries were severe enough to require air evacuation. Back at Ptarmigan Lake, Roger continued his desperate attempt to keep David alive, replacing blood-soaked dressings, checking for breathing and pulse, talking continuously to David, even though there was no sign the ranger could hear him. Patricia had made her way to the site, her fear of the bear overcome by the need to help, and she assisted by holding pressure on wounds, by trying to keep flies away from the injuries, by watching the forest edge for any sign of the bear's return. David's condition was deteriorating minute by minute. His breathing had become irregular, periods of rapid gasping alternating with frightening pauses where he didn't breathe at all. His pulse, which Roger had found initially, was now nearly impossible to detect, thready and weak beneath Roger's blood-slicked fingers. David's skin, where it wasn't covered in blood, was pale, almost grey, the colour of approaching death. His body temperature was dropping, going into shock from massive blood loss. The ground around him was saturated with blood, far more than Roger would have thought a human body could lose and still maintain any signs of life. At 12:19 p.m., the D-Hart helicopter reached Ptarmigan Lake, Reynolds bringing the aircraft in low over the valley, scanning for the casualty site. Parker spotted Roger's bright yellow jacket waving frantically near the lakeshore and directed Reynolds to the location. The problem immediately became apparent. There was nowhere to land. The terrain around the campsite was too rocky, too uneven, and the trees were too close. The nearest possible landing zone was a small meadow, approximately 200 yards away on the opposite side of the lake. "We'll have to land there and hike in," Reynolds said, already maneuvering the helicopter toward the meadow. "Denning, radio dispatch and see if we can get ground teams to bring a litter. We'll need to move the patient to the LZ for evacuation." The helicopter touched down at 12:21 p.m., and Parker and Denning grabbed their gear and began running toward the campsite, each carrying over 70 pounds of medical equipment in packs and cases. The run around the lake and over rough terrain took nearly 4 minutes. Both medics arriving at the site winded, but immediately focused on the patient. Their first sight of David stopped them for a fraction of a second. Experienced trauma professionals momentarily overwhelmed by the extent of injuries. Then training took over. "Jesus Christ," Denning breathed, then louder, "Sir, step back, please, let us work." Roger and Patricia moved away, standing several feet distant, Roger putting his arm around his wife's shoulders as she turned her face into his chest, unable to look at the scene anymore. Denning and Parker worked with coordinated efficiency born from hundreds of critical calls together. No radial pulse, breathing agonal, massive blood loss, Parker called out, her hands checking David's neck for a carotid pulse, finding it but barely. "We need to intubate immediately and get lines in." Denning was already assembling the intubation equipment, pulling out a laryngoscope and endotracheal tube, preparing to secure David's airway. Parker ripped open David's ruined shirt, exposing his chest, and began attaching electrocardiogram leads, even as she noted the massive chest wounds that made finding intact skin for the sticky pads difficult. The portable monitor beeped to life, showing a heart rhythm that was barely adequate, irregular and slow. "He's in shock, severe hypovolemia, starting compressions if we lose his rhythm," Parker said, more to herself than to Denning, her mind running through critical interventions. Denning attempted to intubate David, tilting his head back, inserting the laryngoscope blade and trying to visualize the vocal cords through blood and swelling. "Airways compromised, significant facial trauma. I can't get a clear view," Denning said, trying different angles, suctioning blood that kept filling the airway. I'm going to do a King LT, he decided, abandoning the direct intubation approach and instead inserting a King laryngeal tube, a supraglottic airway device that was easier to place in difficult situations. The tube went in smoothly, and Denning connected a bag valve mask, beginning to squeeze oxygen into David's lungs. Parker was working on vascular access, trying to find a vein in David's arms that hadn't collapsed from blood loss, finally getting an IV catheter into his right external jugular vein, a larger vessel in the neck. She connected IV tubing and began running fluids wide open, hanging a bag of lactated ringers from a makeshift stand. "We need blood products, starting O negative," Parker said, pulling packed red blood cells from the cooler they'd brought, warming one unit in her hands briefly before connecting it to the IV line. Reynolds' voice came over their portable radio. "Medical team, what's your status? What do you need?" Denning keyed his radio. "Patient is critical, life-threatening injuries, significant blood loss. We're providing advanced life support, but his condition is extremely unstable. We need to get him to the helicopter for evacuation ASAP, but we need a litter to move him. We can't carry him manually without causing further injury." "Copy that," Reynolds replied, "and ground team is en route to your location with a litter, ETA 10 minutes. 10 minutes. Parker and Denning exchanged looks. They both knew David might not have 10 minutes. His blood pressure, checked with a portable cuff, was barely registering, 60/40, critically low. His oxygen saturation, measured with a pulse oximeter clipped to his finger, was 76%, dangerously inadequate. His level of consciousness was GCS-3, the lowest possible score, indicating deep coma or approaching brain death. They continued working, replacing dressings on the worst wounds, administering medications to support his blood pressure, breathing for him with the bag valve mask, running more fluids and blood products. Roger and Patricia, standing nearby, watched in awed horror as the medical team fought for David's life, their movements quick and sure, speaking in medical shorthand that the couple didn't understand, but which conveyed the desperate urgency of the situation. The ground team arrived at 12:34 p.m., 2 Rangers and 4 SAR volunteers carrying a Stokes basket, a rigid metal litter designed for rough terrain rescue. Michael Torres was with them, having hiked in at near running pace, driven by the need to be at the scene. He took in the situation with one sweeping glance. David's catastrophic injuries, the blood everywhere, the grim expressions on the flight crew's faces. "How bad?" he asked Denning quietly. "He's alive, barely," Denning replied. "I don't know if he'll make it to the hospital, to be honest with you. But we're going to try." Torres nodded, swallowing hard. "What do you need?" "Help us get him into the litter carefully, and then we need to move fast to the helicopter." Every second counts. The team moved in, coordinating to lift David's body as gently as possible, supporting his head and neck, his torso, his legs, moving him from the ground into the Stokes basket in one smooth motion. David made no sound, gave no indication that he was aware of being moved. They secured him in the litter with straps, and 6 people grabbed the handles, 3 on each side, and began moving quickly but carefully toward the helicopter landing zone. Parker walked beside the litter, squeezing the bag valve mask, continuing to breathe for David. Denning carried their equipment and the portable monitor, watching David's vital signs as they moved. The journey to the helicopter took 8 minutes, navigating around rocks and through brush, trying to keep the litter level, trying not to jar the patient. Reynolds had the helicopter running, rotors at flight idle, ready for immediate takeoff. The team loaded David into the back of the aircraft, securing the litter to the floor mounts, and Parker and Denning climbed in, continuing their medical interventions without pause. Torres leaned in, Kalispell Regional. "Negative," Parker said, His injuries are too severe for Kalispell. We're going direct to Benefice Health System in Great Falls. They have a Level 2 trauma center and the surgeons he needs. Reynolds has already cleared it with flight control. Torres nodded. Keep me updated. Will do. Take care of his family. The door slid shut and Reynolds increased power, lifting off at 12:47 p.m., 46 minutes after the attack had ended. The helicopter climbed rapidly and turned south toward Great Falls, 93 miles away. Flight time would be approximately 35 minutes. In the helicopter, Parker and Denning continued their desperate work, fighting against physiology and time. They hung additional units of blood, administered medications to support David's failing cardiovascular system, checked and rechecked his airway to ensure oxygen was getting to his lungs. David's heart rhythm became increasingly irregular, the monitor showing premature ventricular contractions, dangerous electrical abnormalities that preceded cardiac arrest. "Come on, David, stay with us," Parker said, adjusting medication drips. David's chest rose and fell mechanically with each squeeze of the bag valve mask, his body alive only because of the interventions being provided. His face, swollen and lacerated, was unrecognizable. His eyes, partially open, showed only white, rolled back in his head. Parker found herself wondering about his family, whether he was married, had children, what they would be told, how they would cope with this. She pushed the thoughts away and focused on the technical aspects of keeping him alive. Back at Ptarmigan Lake, Torres was managing the aftermath of the attack and coordinating ongoing response. He had immediately ordered the evacuation of all campers from the lake area and posted rangers at the trailhead to prevent anyone else from hiking in. He had contacted the park's wildlife biologist, Dr. Jennifer Morrison, 52 years old, a specialist in bear behavior with a PhD from Montana State University and 18 years of experience managing human-bear conflicts in Glacier. Morrison was already en route to the scene, with 2 rangers trained in wildlife response. The bear would need to be tracked, evaluated and likely destroyed, standard protocol for a bear that had mauled a human. Torres had also contacted the law enforcement branch, as any serious incident involving a park employee was subject to investigation. Special Agent Robert Hayes of the National Park Service's Investigative Services branch was being flown in from Denver and would arrive by evening to lead the investigation. Torres documented the scene with photographs, measured distances, collected David's scattered equipment, including the discharged bear spray canister. He interviewed Roger and Patricia Simmons at length, getting their detailed account of what they had witnessed. Roger's testimony was clear. The bear came out of the forest and charged directly at the ranger. There was no warning, no bluff charge, just a full-speed attack. The ranger deployed his bear spray, but the wind was wrong and it didn't stop the bear. The impact was massive. The bear mauled him for what felt like forever, but was probably only a couple of minutes. I started making noise and the bear looked up, then bit the ranger one more time and ran back into the forest. Patricia added, "It was so fast and so violent." The ranger didn't have a chance. Dr. Morrison arrived at the scene at 1:30 p.m. and immediately began her assessment. She examined the bear tracks, the claw marks on the tree, the scattered camping gear, the evidence of the attack. She measured the paw print David had photographed, noting its size and characteristics. She collected scat samples from the bear dropping David had found on the trail. She documented everything with photographs and notes, building a profile of the bear and its behavior. Her preliminary assessment was troubling. The attack had characteristics of both defensive and predatory behavior. The initial charge could be interpreted as a bear responding to what it perceived as a threat to a food source or territory, but the sustained mauling and the fact that the bear had been stalking David suggested something more complex. The fresh evidence of the bear being at Whitfield's campsite and possibly at other campsites indicated the animal was investigating human sites, a behavior that could lead to food conditioning if the bear found and consumed human food. "We need to track this bear and assess its behavior," Morrison told Torres. "Based on what I'm seeing here, I'm recommending it be removed from the population, regardless of what we find. A bear that's attacked a human with this level of aggression is too dangerous to leave in the park." Torres agreed. "I'll authorize whatever resources you need. We need to find this bear before someone else gets hurt." Morrison had already requested that park management bring in professional bear trackers and houndsmen, specialists who used trained dogs to track and tree bears, making them easier to locate and evaluate. But this would take time, and bears moved quickly through their territories. The window for finding the specific bear responsible for the attack was limited. Morrison and her team began setting up trail cameras at the attack site and along game trails leading away from the lake, hoping to capture images of the bear returning to the area. They also began preparing protocol for identifying the specific bear if they located candidates, which would involve examining physical characteristics, comparing DNA from saliva that might be present in David's wounds, and analyzing behavioral patterns. In Great Falls, Benefice Health System's trauma center had been alerted to the incoming helicopter and had assembled their emergency response team. Dr. Robert Hendricks, 56 years old, the chief trauma surgeon on duty that afternoon, had dealt with serious injuries throughout his 30-year career, including multiple bear maulings, farming accidents, industrial incidents, and vehicular trauma. He stood in the ambulance bay with his team, dressed in surgical scrubs, waiting as the helicopter appeared in the distance, its distinctive sound growing louder as it approached. The helicopter landed at 1:22 p.m. on the hospital's rooftop helipad, and the trauma team was at the doors as they opened. Parker and Denning jumped out first, already providing report. 42-year-old male park ranger, attacked by grizzly bear approximately 90 minutes ago, sustained multiple catastrophic injuries, including massive facial trauma, left shoulder avulsion, multiple rib fractures, penetrating chest and abdominal trauma, severe blood loss. We've administered 4 units of O-negative blood, pushed fluids. He's intubated with a King LT airway, has 1 large bore IV. Blood pressure is 70/40, heart rate is 45 and irregular. Oxygen saturation is 68% and dropping despite assisted ventilation. He's had 2 periods of cardiac arrest in flight that we reversed with CPR and epinephrine. Prognosis is extremely poor. Dr. Hendricks looked down at David's broken body as they transferred him to the hospital gurney. Even with decades of experience with severe trauma, he found himself momentarily shocked by the extent of injuries. "Get him to Trauma Bay 1, alert surgery, and call in additional staff. We need to move fast if he has any chance at all." The team rushed David into the hospital, down corridors cleared of other traffic, into the specialized trauma bay equipped with imaging, surgical capability, and everything needed for immediate life-saving intervention. Hendricks and his team went to work, cutting away the remaining clothes, exposing the full extent of David's injuries. Multiple penetrating wounds to chest and abdomen, visible intestinal herniation, significant facial trauma with possible skull fracture, left shoulder appears to be partially disarticulated, both arms showing defensive wounds. Hendricks dictated to the surgical recorder, documenting injuries as the team worked. "Get me a chest X-ray, abdominal ultrasound, and type and cross for 10 units of blood. Start massive transfusion protocol." The team moved with choreographed precision, each member knowing their role, working to stabilize David enough to get him into the operating room where they might be able to repair some of the damage. The chest X-ray showed multiple rib fractures on both sides, a pneumothorax on the right side, where air had accumulated in the chest cavity from a punctured lung, and concerning opacity in both lung fields suggesting blood. Hendricks inserted a chest tube, threading it between David's ribs into the chest cavity, and was rewarded with a rush of blood that filled the collection chamber. Hemothorax, probably 500 cubic centimeters already drained, Hendricks noted. The abdominal ultrasound showed free fluid throughout the abdominal cavity, indicating internal bleeding, likely from liver or spleen damage, possibly from intestinal perforation. He needs surgery immediately, Hendricks decided. We're not going to get him any more stable than this without operating. Transport him to OR3. I'll be scrubbed in 2 minutes. As the team wheeled David toward the operating rooms, Hendricks pulled out his phone and made a call he dreaded. The hospital's social services department, requesting they locate and contact the patient's next of kin. The staff would need to find David's family and inform them that their husband and father had been critically injured and might not survive. Margaret Collins was in her classroom at Elrod Elementary School, preparing materials for the upcoming school year, even though it was still summer, when her cell phone rang. She didn't recognize the number, but answered anyway, her tone professional. "This is Margaret Collins." The voice on the other end was female, gentle but serious. "Mrs. Collins, this is Amanda Walsh from Benefice Health System in Great Falls. I'm calling about your husband, David Collins." Margaret's world narrowed to that moment, everything else falling away, a cold fear gripping her chest. What happened? Is he hurt? "Mrs. Collins, your husband has been seriously injured in an incident at Glacier National Park. He's currently in our emergency trauma center receiving treatment. I need you to understand that his injuries are very severe, and the doctors are working to stabilize him right now." Margaret's legs went weak, and she grabbed the edge of her desk for support. "What kind of incident? What happened?" "I don't have all the details, but I was told it involved a wildlife encounter." "Mrs. Collins, I need you to get to Great Falls as quickly as you can. Do you have someone who can drive you? You shouldn't drive yourself." Yes, my neighbor, she can. I have kids, my children. They're at home, Emma and Michael." "You should bring them with you. I'm going to give you the direct number for our trauma social services, and they'll meet you when you arrive to update you on your husband's condition." Margaret made the 90-minute drive to Great Falls in a daze, her neighbor Julie Morrison driving, while Margaret sat in the passenger seat, occasionally texting Emma and Michael in the back seat, trying to answer their frightened questions while not having answers herself. The hospital had told her David was alive, was in surgery, that the doctors were doing everything possible. But the careful tone of the social worker's voice had communicated what the words didn't. David might not make it. Margaret kept thinking about the last conversation they'd had, the night before, talking about bear claws and the weekend together, such mundane, comfortable things, and how she'd never imagined it might be the last time they spoke. She thought about 17 years of marriage, about David proposing on a hiking trail at sunset with the mountains all around them, about Emma as a baby sleeping on David's chest, about Michael learning to cast a fly rod with David patient and encouraging beside him. She thought about growing old together, retirement, grandchildren, all the assumed future that now seemed impossibly fragile. They arrived at Benefice at 3:15 p.m., were met immediately by the social worker and a hospital chaplain, and escorted to a private waiting room. "Your husband is still in surgery," Amanda Walsh, the social worker, explained gently. "Dr. Hendricks is the lead surgeon, and he's one of the best trauma surgeons in Montana. They're working on repairing internal injuries and stabilizing your husband enough to get him through the next critical hours. As soon as there's any update, Dr. Hendricks will come speak with you personally." "How bad is it?" Margaret asked, her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her face. Emma was pressed against her side, 17 years old and trying to be strong, trying not to cry. failing. Michael sat on Margaret's other side, 14 and looking younger, his eyes wide with shock. Amanda hesitated, then decided honesty was more compassionate than vague reassurances. His injuries are very severe. He was attacked by a bear, and he has significant trauma to multiple body systems. He's lost a lot of blood. The fact that he made it here alive is testament to the medical team that treated him in the field and during transport. The next 24 to 48 hours will be critical. Dr. Hendricks will be able to give you more specific information once he's done in surgery. The surgery lasted 6 hours. During that time, Margaret alternated between praying, pacing, staring at the wall, answering calls from concerned friends and family who had somehow heard about the incident, fending off 2 media outlets who had tracked down her number and wanted statements, trying to comfort her children, and simply existing in a state of suspended terror. At 7:45 p.m., Dr. Hendricks entered the waiting room still in his surgical scrubs, his face showing the exhaustion of hours of intense concentration. Margaret stood immediately, her hand gripping Emma's. "How is he?" Hendricks gestured for them to sit and took a seat across from them. "Your husband is out of surgery and has been moved to the surgical intensive care unit. He's alive, which is significant given the severity of his injuries. But I need you to understand that his condition is critical, and the next day or two will determine whether he survives." Hendricks detailed the injuries and what his team had done. They'd repaired multiple internal injuries, including a ruptured spleen which they'd removed, a lacerated liver which they'd sutured, multiple perforated loops of intestine which they'd resected and reconnected, a collapsed lung which they'd reinflated. They'd transfused massive amounts of blood, replaced fluids, addressed fractures. David's left shoulder had required orthopedic consultation and would need multiple additional surgeries to repair. His facial injuries were severe and would require plastic and reconstructive surgery. His skull had multiple fractures, but no brain bleed apparent on imaging. "He's on a ventilator, heavily sedated, and we're monitoring him continuously. He's developed complications, including acute respiratory distress syndrome from the trauma. His kidneys are showing signs of failure from the shock and blood loss, and we're concerned about infection given the contaminated nature of his wounds. Mrs. Collins, I want you to understand that even though we've done everything we can surgically, your husband is not out of danger. His survival is still very uncertain." Margaret nodded slowly, processing information that seemed both too technical and too terrible to fully comprehend. "Can I see him?" "Yes, but I need to prepare you. He doesn't look like himself right now. He has multiple tubes and lines, machines monitoring and supporting his vital functions, and his injuries have caused significant swelling and disfigurement. Some of what you'll see will be disturbing." "I need to see my husband," Margaret said firmly. Hendricks nodded. "I'll have a nurse take you to the ICU. Your children can come too if you think they're ready for that." Margaret looked at Emma and Michael. Emma nodded. Michael hesitated, then nodded as well. They followed a nurse through corridors, up an elevator, through the secured doors of the ICU, to a room where machines beeped and hissed, and David lay in the bed, barely recognizable as himself. Margaret stopped in the doorway, her hand flying to her mouth, a sound escaping her throat that was half gasp, half sob. Emma turned away, unable to look. Michael stood frozen, staring at his father's brutalized body. David's head was bandaged, his face so swollen that his features were distorted beyond recognition. Tubes protruded from his mouth, his nose, his neck, his chest, his arms. Monitors surrounded the bed, displaying numbers and waveforms that meant nothing to Margaret, but which the nurse explained were his heart rate, his blood pressure, his oxygen levels, his respiratory rate. A ventilator breathed for him, the machine's rhythmic whooshing the only sound besides the monitors. His chest rose and fell mechanically. His arms lay motionless at his sides, one heavily bandaged, the other punctured with IV lines. Margaret approached the bed slowly, reaching out to touch David's hand, the only part of him that looked relatively undamaged. His skin was cool, clammy. She squeezed gently, willing him to squeeze back to give any sign that he knew she was there. Nothing. "David," she whispered, "it's Margaret. I'm here. Emma and Michael are here. We're here with you. You have to fight, okay? You have to come back to us." No response, just the mechanical breathing, the beeping monitors, the clinical evidence of a body being kept alive by technology and expertise, but hovering at the edge of death. The nurse explained that David was deeply sedated, that he wouldn't be able to respond even if he could hear her, that his brain function was being preserved, but he was essentially unconscious. "Talk to him anyway," the nurse suggested kindly. "Some patients report remembering voices from when they were sedated. It can help." Margaret pulled a chair to the bedside and sat, holding David's hand, and began talking, telling him about the drive to the hospital, about how she'd rearranged everything to be here, about the kids and how worried they were, about mundane things like the garden at home and the hummingbirds at the feeder and the plans they'd made for the weekend. She talked because it was the only thing she could do, the only way to connect with him across the distance of trauma and medication and machines. Over the following days, David's condition fluctuated wildly, improving slightly one day only to decline the next, a pattern that the ICU doctors explained was typical for severe trauma patients. By the third day after the attack, David had developed a serious infection, bacteria from his wounds, from his environment at Ptarmigan Lake, from the bear's teeth and claws, multiplying in his damaged tissues despite aggressive antibiotic therapy. His fever spiked to 104 degrees Fahrenheit. His blood pressure dropped, requiring additional medications. His oxygen levels plummeted despite maximum ventilator support. Dr. Patricia Nowak, the intensivist managing David's care, called a family conference and explained the situation bluntly. "David is developing multi-organ failure. His kidneys have stopped functioning and we've started dialysis. His lungs are severely damaged and not exchanging oxygen adequately, even with the ventilator at maximum settings. His liver is showing signs of failure. His heart is struggling despite multiple medications to support it. Essentially, every major organ system is under tremendous stress from the trauma and the infection, and his body is struggling to recover. We're doing everything medically possible, but I need you to understand that his chances of survival are very low at this point, probably less than 20%. And even if he does survive, he will face a very long recovery with possible permanent disabilities." Margaret listened to this with a numbness that came from days of crying, fear, and exhaustion. She hadn't left the hospital except for brief trips to the nearby hotel where they'd taken a room. Emma had returned to Kalispell with Julie Morrison, unable to handle watching her father dying by inches. Michael remained, sitting silently in the ICU waiting room, occasionally allowed brief visits to his father's bedside. Margaret had made the necessary calls to family, to David's supervisors, to their pastor, to the school, to let them know she wouldn't be returning to work for the foreseeable future. She'd given a brief statement to the media that the hospital's public relations staff had helped her craft, asking for privacy and prayers. She'd dealt with insurance paperwork, with hospital administrative staff, with the endless bureaucracy that accompanied catastrophic illness. And through it all, she'd sat beside David's bed, holding his hand, talking to him, willing him to live. "What are his chances if he makes it through this crisis?" Margaret asked Dr. Nowak. "If his organs begin to recover, if we can get the infection under control, if his body can heal, he'll face months of hospitalization and rehabilitation. He'll need multiple additional surgeries to repair his shoulder, to address his facial injuries, possibly other procedures depending on complications. He'll likely have permanent injuries, including potential cognitive deficits from the time his brain was oxygen deprived, possible kidney dysfunction, certainly chronic pain. But he could potentially recover enough to have a meaningful quality of life. I've seen patients survive things that seemed impossible, and I've seen patients die from injuries that seemed survivable. I can't predict which way David will go. I can only tell you we're fighting for him every single day. Margaret looked through the glass window at her husband, at the man she'd loved for almost 20 years, seeing him surrounded by tubes and machines, his body broken, his survival uncertain, and she felt a rage beginning to build beneath her grief and fear. A rage at the bear that had done this, at the circumstances that had put David in its path, at the randomness of a split-second encounter that had destroyed their lives. She knew, intellectually, that the bear was just an animal following its instincts, that David had been in the bear's territory, that these encounters happened occasionally in wild places. But emotionally, viscerally, she wanted the bear found, wanted it destroyed, wanted some kind of justice or revenge or acknowledgement that what had happened was monstrously unfair. She thought about David's years of service, his dedication to protecting the park and its wildlife, the irony of him being nearly killed by the very animals he'd worked to conserve. She thought about Emma and Michael, potentially growing up without their father. She thought about growing old alone, and she allowed herself, for just a moment, to hate the bear with an intensity that surprised her. Back at Glacier National Park, the investigation and response continued. Dr. Morrison's team had been tracking the bear using trail cameras, dogs, and direct observation. They'd identified 3 potential candidates, male grizzlies that ranged through the Ptarmigan area, but determining which specific bear had been responsible for the attack was proving difficult. The park had closed the entire Ptarmigan drainage to all human access, posted warning signs throughout the Many Glacier area, and instituted enhanced bear safety protocols for all visitors. Special Agent Hayes had interviewed everyone involved: Roger and Patricia Simmons, who had witnessed the attack, Marcus Whitfield, the camper whose tent had been at the site, Sarah Chen, the dispatcher, Michael Torres and the other rangers, the medical personnel. Hayes had examined the scene extensively, taken measurements, reviewed photographs, studied David's GPS track and radio logs, trying to reconstruct exactly what had happened and whether any safety protocols had been violated or any procedures not followed. His preliminary conclusion was that David had done nothing wrong, had followed all established safety practices, and had simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time, encountering a bear that was behaving unpredictably. The media coverage had been intense. Park Ranger fights for life after grizzly attack, read headlines across Montana and beyond. News crews camped at the park entrance, interviewed visitors, filmed stand-ups with the mountains in the background, discussed bear safety and the dangers of working in grizzly country. Some coverage was sympathetic and factual, focusing on David's long career and the inherent risks of his job. Other coverage was sensationalistic, using dramatic language about killer bears and questioning whether grizzlies should be allowed in areas accessible to humans. Environmental groups and wildlife advocates pushed back against this narrative, emphasizing the importance of grizzly conservation and noting that fatal bear attacks were extremely rare, that humans entered bear habitat at their own risk, and that removing bears from their historical range was neither practical nor ethically appropriate. The debate played out in newspaper opinion sections, on television news programs, and extensively on social media, where opinions ranged from thoughtful to inflammatory. On August 19, 2024, 7 days after the attack, park rangers using tracking dogs located and treed a male grizzly approximately 3 miles from Ptarmigan Lake. The bear was immobilized using a dart rifle and examined by Dr. Morrison and her team. Physical measurements confirmed it was a large male, approximately 680 pounds, matching descriptions of the bear seen in the area. They collected DNA samples from the bear's claws and mouth, took photographs documenting its physical condition, and affixed a radio collar before allowing it to recover from the immobilization drugs. DNA analysis would take several days, but would compare genetic material from the bear to saliva and other biological material from David's wounds, potentially confirming whether this was the specific animal responsible for the attack. The bear was released after recovering from the drugs, and its movements were monitored remotely via the radio collar to determine its behavior patterns and whether it was frequenting human use areas. The DNA results came back on August 24th. The bear they'd captured was a match to material from David's wounds. This bear had attacked David Collins. A meeting was convened at park headquarters involving park management, wildlife biologists, law enforcement, and representatives from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, which has jurisdiction over grizzlies as a threatened species under the Endangered Species Act. The decision regarding the bear's fate was controversial and difficult. Dr. Morrison presented her assessment. This bear showed stalking behavior and sustained aggression during the attack, which are concerning. However, our monitoring since releasing it shows it's not frequenting human areas, is avoiding contact with people, and is engaging in normal foraging behavior. The attack may have been triggered by recent food conditioning from finding improperly stored food at campsites, combined with territorial behavior and the bear's hyperphagic state. There's no evidence this bear is inherently aggressive toward humans or that it poses an ongoing threat if human food sources are properly managed. Others argued that any bear that had attacked a human, particularly with the severity shown in this case, was too dangerous to remain in an area used by visitors. After extensive debate, the decision was made. The bear would remain in the population but would be intensively monitored via its radio collar, and any evidence of it approaching human areas or showing concerning behavior would result in immediate removal. The Ptarmigan drainage would remain closed for the rest of the 2024 season. Enhanced food storage requirements would be enforced throughout the park. The decision was announced publicly and was met with mixed reactions. Supporters praising the park for not automatically destroying the bear, critics arguing the park was prioritizing animals over human safety. David Collins regained consciousness on August 28, 2024, 16 days after the attack, emerging gradually from the induced coma as his medical team reduced his sedation. His first awareness was pain, overwhelming and omnipresent, followed by confusion about where he was and what had happened. Margaret was at his bedside when his eyes opened and focused on her face. "David," she breathed, squeezing his hand. "You're in the hospital. You're safe. You were hurt, but you're going to be okay." David tried to speak but couldn't, the ventilator tube still in place, preventing speech. His eyes moved around the room, taking in the unfamiliar surroundings, the medical equipment, Margaret's face showing strain and exhaustion. Memories came in fragments: the morning at the ranger station, hiking the trail, the campsite at Ptarmigan Lake, and then a massive dark shape moving toward him with terrifying speed. The bear, the impact, pain beyond anything he'd imagined possible. And then nothing, a blank void until now. He tried to move, felt restraints holding his arms, felt the tube in his throat, felt pain radiating from everywhere. Panic rose, his heart rate spiking, monitors alarming. Margaret pressed the call button and nurses rushed in, explaining to David what had happened, where he was, that he was safe, gradually calming him. Dr. Nowak arrived and made the decision to remove the ventilator tube, believing David was strong enough to breathe on his own now. The extubation process was uncomfortable, David coughing and gagging as the tube was pulled from his throat, but finally breathing independently for the first time in over 2 weeks. His voice, when he tried to speak, was barely a whisper, hoarse and weak. What happened? Over the following hours and days, as David's consciousness cleared, the full scope of what he'd survived became apparent to him. His body was broken in ways that would take months or years to heal, if they healed completely at all. His left shoulder had been so severely damaged that the orthopedic surgeons told him he'd likely never regain full function, that even after multiple planned reconstructive surgeries, he'd have limited range of motion and chronic pain. His face had been reconstructed as much as possible, but he would be permanently scarred. His appearance altered. He'd lost his spleen, would be more susceptible to infections for the rest of his life. His kidney function was gradually improving, but remained impaired. He'd developed complications during his hospitalization, including pneumonia, blood clots, and pressure ulcers from prolonged bed rest. But he was alive, an outcome that had seemed impossible during those first desperate days. Physically, he would survive. Psychologically was another matter. David's psychological response to the trauma began to emerge as his physical condition stabilized. He experienced vivid flashbacks triggered by unexpected stimuli. The sound of a helicopter passing overhead sent him into a panic attack, convinced he was back in the helicopter being airlifted from Ptarmigan Lake. The smell of certain disinfectants used in his hospital room triggered memories of the attack, his mind somehow associating the scent with the forest. He had nightmares when he slept, reliving the attack over and over, waking in the ICU screaming, his heart racing, covered in sweat. The hospital's psychiatric consultation service diagnosed him with acute stress disorder, which they explained would likely evolve into post-traumatic stress disorder requiring long-term treatment. A psychologist specializing in trauma began working with David, helping him process what had happened, teaching him coping strategies, preparing him for the long psychological recovery that would parallel his physical healing. David struggled to articulate the fear he'd experienced during those seconds when the bear was attacking him, the absolute certainty that he was dying, the helplessness and pain. He struggled with guilt over putting his family through this ordeal, over the resources spent on his rescue and treatment, over the impact his injury had on park operations. He struggled with anger at the bear, at fate, at himself for not doing something differently that might have prevented the attack. The psychologist assured him all these responses were normal, that trauma recovery was non-linear, that he would have good days and bad days, that with time and support he could work through this. Margaret struggled with her own trauma responses. She developed severe anxiety, constantly worried about David despite his improving condition, unable to sleep more than a few hours at a time, jumping at unexpected noises, crying at random moments. She'd essentially put her own life on hold, taking a leave of absence from her teaching position, rearranging everything to be present for David's care and recovery. Emma had returned to school for her senior year, but was distracted and struggling academically, her mind constantly on her father. Michael had become withdrawn, spending hours alone in his room, not wanting to talk about what had happened. The entire family was traumatized, their normal life shattered, trying to navigate a new reality where the wilderness David had loved and dedicated his career to protecting had nearly killed him. They began family therapy sessions, working together to process the trauma, to support each other, to find a path forward. By mid-September, David had been transferred from the surgical ICU to a general medical floor, a sign of progress. He was out of bed for short periods in a wheelchair, working with physical therapists to rebuild strength and mobility. He'd undergone the first of what would be several reconstructive surgeries on his shoulder, a lengthy procedure that the orthopedic surgeon, Dr. Raymond Chen, described as successful, but noted that David would need extensive physical therapy and additional surgeries. David's facial injuries were healing slowly, the swelling gradually subsiding to reveal scars that were still red and raised, but which plastic surgeons assured him would fade with time and could be further improved with additional procedures if he chose. He'd lost over 30 pounds, his body having catabolized muscle mass during the weeks of critical illness. He looked gaunt, older than his 42 years, his eyes carrying a haunted quality that hadn't been there before August 12th. But he was alive, conscious, able to speak and think and interact with his family. He was, against all odds and contrary to multiple medical professionals' expectations, going to survive. The Park Service had handled the aftermath of David's injury with appropriate gravity. His medical expenses were covered under workers' compensation, removing at least that financial burden from the family. His salary continued despite his inability to work. Counseling services were provided for the entire family. Park Superintendent Elizabeth Warner had visited David in the hospital, expressing the organization's support and making clear that David's job would be waiting for him when and if he was able to return to work, though no one had any expectation that would happen soon, if ever. David's colleagues had organized fundraisers to help the family, collecting thousands of dollars to offset non-medical expenses. The Ranger community nationally had rallied around David, sending cards, letters, gifts, offers of support. It was touching and overwhelming, evidence of the tight-knit nature of the profession and the deep respect David had earned through his years of service. The investigation into the attack concluded in early October, with Special Agent Hayes issuing a comprehensive report that found no fault on David's part, no violations of procedure, no negligence. The attack was determined to be an unpredictable wildlife encounter, one of the inherent risks of working in bear habitat. Hayes's report made several recommendations for reducing similar incidents in the future. Enhanced food storage requirements for campers, increased signage about bear safety, more frequent patrols of backcountry camping areas, and consideration of requiring all backcountry users to carry bear spray. Some recommendations were adopted immediately. Others were tabled for further study and public comment. The report was made public and received significant media attention, with coverage generally agreeing that the attack had been a tragic but unavoidable incident, the kind of low probability but high consequence event that occurred occasionally when humans and large predators shared space. David was discharged from Benefice Health System on October 3, 2024, nearly 8 weeks after the attack, transferred to a skilled nursing and rehabilitation facility closer to Kalispell, where he would continue intensive physical and occupational therapy. The day he left the hospital, he asked to be wheeled outside to feel sun on his face and fresh air in his lungs, simple pleasures he hadn't experienced in 2 months. Margaret stood beside his wheelchair in the hospital courtyard, her hand on his shoulder, as David closed his eyes and simply breathed, feeling the warmth of autumn sun, smelling the scent of pine and approaching winter on the breeze, listening to birds calling in nearby trees. He felt an overwhelming gratitude to be alive, coupled with an awareness of how fragile that life was, how quickly everything could change, how the boundary between living and dying was sometimes measured in seconds and chance. "I'm ready to go home," he said quietly to Margaret. "Not yet," she replied gently. "But soon. We'll get you there soon." He nodded, accepting this, understanding that his journey back to anything resembling his previous life would be long and difficult, but feeling determined to make that journey, to reclaim what he could of who he'd been before August 12, 2024. The bear that had attacked David Collins continued to roam its territory in the mountains of Glacier National Park, monitored remotely through the radio collar, but otherwise living its life according to the ancient patterns of its species. It fed on the last berries of autumn, excavated ground squirrels from their burrows, occasionally scavenged elk killed by wolves. It avoided areas of human activity as it had done for most of its 12-year life. As autumn progressed toward winter, the bear entered its den, a cavity excavated under the roots of a large white-bark pine on a northeast-facing slope at nearly 9,000 feet elevation. It would sleep through the winter, its metabolism slowed, its body temperature reduced, living off accumulated fat reserves. In spring, it would emerge and the cycle would begin again. The bear moving through its range, foraging, mating if opportunity arose, completely unaware of the human drama its actions had triggered, completely indifferent to the fact that it had nearly killed a man. It was simply a bear, doing what bears do, living according to instinct and opportunity in the wild places that were its home. That this sometimes brought bears into conflict with humans was inevitable in a landscape where both species existed, a fundamental reality of sharing space with large predators that humans had spent thousands of years trying to avoid by eliminating predators from most of their range. Glacier National Park was one of the few places left where that ancient dynamic still played out, where humans entered wilderness knowing they were not the dominant species, where risk was real and encounters could have consequences. For David Collins, those consequences had been nearly fatal. For the bear, that August morning was just another day in a life measured by seasons and survival, notable to the bear not at all. By December 2024, David had made enough progress in rehabilitation that he was able to move back home to Kalispell, though with extensive modifications to the house to accommodate his limitations. He still used a wheelchair for longer distances, was working with a walker for short trips, and hoped eventually to graduate to a cane. His left arm hung mostly useless, the shoulder too damaged to recover significant function despite the surgeries. He'd learned to do most tasks one-handed, a frustrating limitation for someone who'd been physically capable his entire life. His face bore permanent scars, pale lines, and puckered tissue that tracked across his cheek and forehead. People stared when they saw him in public, then looked away quickly when they realized they'd been staring. David had learned to endure this, understanding that his appearance now told a story visible to anyone who looked. He'd gained back some of the weight he'd lost, but he remained thinner than before, his body composition permanently altered by months of physical trauma and recovery. His psychological recovery was progressing more slowly than the physical healing. He continued to have nightmares, flashbacks, periods of intense anxiety. Loud, sudden noises caused panic responses. He couldn't watch nature documentaries featuring bears. The thought of hiking in the wilderness, something he'd loved for his entire adult life, now filled him with dread rather than joy. He was in ongoing therapy, taking medications for anxiety and depression, working through layers of trauma with his psychologist. Some days were better than others. Christmas 2024 was both joyous, the family together, and grateful David was alive, and somber, all of them aware of how close they'd come to spending the holiday planning a funeral instead of unwrapping presents. Emma had been accepted early decision to the University of Montana and would start in the fall. Michael was doing better, had joined the school's fishing club, was talking more about what had happened rather than keeping it bottled up inside. Margaret had returned to work part-time, finding that the normalcy of her classroom and her students helped ground her, gave her something to focus on besides medical appointments and therapy sessions. David's future with the National Park Service remained uncertain. He was technically still employed, still on extended medical leave, but everyone, including David himself, recognized that he would likely never return to fieldwork. He couldn't hike long distances with his physical limitations, couldn't respond to emergencies, couldn't do most of the physical tasks that defined a ranger's job. There had been discussions about transitioning him to a desk role, something in education or administrative support, positions that would allow him to continue serving the Park Service without requiring him to work in the backcountry. David was ambivalent about this. Part of him wanted to continue his career in some capacity, to not let the attack end his service. Another part of him felt disconnected from the work now, questioning whether he wanted to continue dedicating his life to protecting places and animals that had nearly killed him. He was considering retirement, possibly pursuing different work, maybe teaching about wilderness safety or working with other trauma survivors. These were decisions for the future, once he'd recovered more fully and could think clearly about what he wanted the rest of his life to look like. In February 2025, David agreed to participate in a documentary about bear attacks being produced by a wildlife film company, hoping his story might help educate people about bear safety and the realities of living alongside large predators. The filming was difficult, requiring him to discuss details of the attack that he'd been trying not to think about, but he pushed through, believing the educational value was important. He was filmed in his home, in physical therapy sessions, and at the hospital where he'd been treated. He recorded an interview where he described the attack in detail, explained his recovery process, discussed his ongoing physical and psychological challenges. The production company also interviewed Margaret, Emma, Michael, the medical personnel who'd treated him, rangers who'd been involved in the response, and Dr. Morrison about bear behavior and management. The documentary, titled 3 Minutes: A Ranger's Survival, was released in April 2025 and received significant attention, winning awards and being widely used in bear safety education programs. David found watching it difficult. Seeing himself describe events he still struggled to process, seeing his family's pain articulated on screen. But he was proud of the final product and the educational message it conveyed. The one-year anniversary of the attack, August 12, 2025, was a difficult day for David and his family. They spent it together at home, quietly, reflecting on how much had changed in a year. David had come incredibly far in his recovery, had survived against long odds, had rebuilt pieces of his life, but he was not the man he'd been on August 11, 2024, that David Collins, the capable ranger who hiked miles through mountain wilderness without effort, who loved his work unreservedly, who moved through the world with confidence and physical capability, was gone. This David Collins was different. More fragile, more cautious, carrying scars both visible and hidden, struggling with limitations and losses. He was learning to accept this new version of himself, to find meaning and purpose in a life that looked different than he'd planned. It was not the life he would have chosen, but it was the life he had, and he was determined to make something worthwhile from it. As 2025 progressed, David began speaking publicly about his experience, giving talks at ranger training sessions, appearing at conferences on wildlife management and human-bear coexistence, participating in educational programs about trauma recovery. He found that talking about what had happened, rather than avoiding it, helped him process the experience and gave him a sense of purpose. If his story could prevent even one similar incident, if his experience could educate people about bear safety and the importance of proper protocols, then perhaps some good could come from the tragedy. He became an advocate for enhanced bear safety education, for proper funding of wildlife management programs, for supporting families dealing with trauma. He worked with organizations providing services to trauma survivors, drawing on his own experience to help others navigate their recovery journeys. He discovered that while the attack had taken much from him, it had also given him unique perspective and the ability to connect with others who had experienced severe trauma. Margaret and David's marriage was tested by the events of August 2024, and their aftermath, the strain of prolonged crisis and recovery affecting their relationship in ways both obvious and subtle. but they worked through it together, finding that the experience, while terrible, had ultimately deepened their commitment to each other. They'd faced the possibility of David's death together, had walked through months of uncertainty and fear, and had emerged on the other side still connected, still partners. They renewed their wedding vows on their 20th anniversary in a small ceremony in their backyard, Emma and Michael present, a quiet affirmation of their choice to continue forward together. David's vows included a promise to cherish each day, having learned through brutal experience how precious and precarious life was. Margaret's vows included a promise to continue supporting David through whatever challenges still lay ahead, knowing recovery was ongoing rather than complete. Emma started at the University of Montana in fall 2025, pursuing her wildlife biology degree with a new appreciation for the complexities and risks of working with wild animals. She'd been shaped by watching her father nearly die from a bear attack, by seeing the psychological aftermath of trauma, by understanding in visceral ways that wildlife management involved more than academic theories. She approached her studies seriously, already thinking ahead to how she might contribute to better coexistence strategies between humans and large predators, how she might help prevent incidents like the one that had nearly killed her father. Michael, now 15, continued his passion for fly fishing, but had developed a new caution about wilderness activities, an awareness that the beautiful wild places he loved could also be dangerous. He and David talked about this, David encouraging Michael not to let fear prevent him from experiencing wilderness, but also emphasizing the importance of awareness, preparation, and respect for the power of nature. The bear that had attacked David Collins lived on in the wilderness of Glacier National Park, its radio collar eventually falling off or failing after the 2-year battery life expired. It was no longer monitored, no longer tracked, just another grizzly among the 300 that ranged through the park's vast acreage. It had likely never thought about the encounter with the human at Ptarmigan Lake, had no memory that would meaningfully distinguish that incident from hundreds of other events in its life. It continued to do what grizzly bears do: forage, mate, sleep through winters, emerge in spring to begin the cycle again. It might live another decade or more, potentially to age 25 or older, or it might die tomorrow from any of the various causes that end bears' lives: competition with other bears, starvation, disease, human conflict. Its life and David's life had intersected for approximately 3 minutes on a summer morning in 2024, and those 3 minutes had completely altered David's existence while meaning nothing to the bear. This asymmetry, the fact that an event that had been catastrophic for David had been unremarkable for the bear, was something David struggled to reconcile. Bears were not evil, were not malicious, were simply animals following instinct. His injury had been random, unpredictable, no one's fault in any meaningful sense. Understanding this intellectually was one thing, accepting it emotionally was another challenge entirely in his ongoing recovery. By late 2025, David had made the decision to formally retire from the National Park Service, accepting a disability retirement package that would provide financial support for his family, while acknowledging that he would not be returning to active ranger duties. It was a difficult decision, closing a chapter of his life that had defined him for nearly 2 decades, saying goodbye to a career he'd loved. The Park Service organized a retirement ceremony in November 2025, attended by dozens of current and former colleagues, where Superintendent Warner presented David with various commendations, recognizing his years of service and his courage in the face of his injuries. David gave a brief speech, his voice shaking with emotion, thanking everyone who had supported his family through the ordeal, praising the medical personnel who had saved his life, acknowledging the Rangers and SAR volunteers who had responded to his emergency. He spoke about the importance of the work the Park Service does, the privilege of protecting America's wild places, and the nobility of accepting calculated risks in service of that mission. He encouraged young rangers to learn from his experience, but not to be paralyzed by fear, to approach wilderness with respect and preparation, but also with joy and wonder. It was a moving conclusion to a career that had ended far differently than anyone could have predicted. David's story became something of a legend within the Ranger community and the broader wilderness safety community, discussed in training sessions, analyzed in after-action reports, featured in safety publications. The Collins incident became a case study in bear attack survival, in emergency response coordination, in trauma medicine, in psychological recovery. David found himself frequently contacted by researchers, by other bear attack survivors seeking connection and advice, by journalists writing about human-wildlife conflict. He responded to these requests when he had energy and emotional capacity, trying to contribute to broader understanding of these complex issues, trying to ensure that other families wouldn't have to experience what his had endured. He emphasized in all these communications that his attack had been a rare event, that millions of people safely enjoyed wilderness experiences every year, that fear of bears shouldn't prevent people from experiencing the beauty of wild places. But he also emphasized the importance of preparation, of bear safety education, of proper food storage, of carrying and knowing how to use bear spray, of making noise while hiking, of all the strategies that might prevent surprise encounters. His message was one of respectful coexistence rather than fear or the elimination of predators from the landscape. In spring 2026, nearly 2 years after the attack, David returned to Glacier National Park for the first time since August 12, 2024. He didn't hike into the backcountry, wasn't physically capable of that, and wasn't sure he ever would be again. But he drove the Going to the Sun road with Margaret, stopped at overlooks, breathed mountain air, took in views of peaks and glaciers and wilderness stretching to distant horizons. It was emotionally overwhelming, being back in the place where his life had nearly ended, surrounded by beauty that now carried associations with terror and pain. But it was also cathartic, a confrontation with trauma, a reclaiming of space in a landscape that he still loved despite everything. They stopped at the Many Glacier area, looked down the trail toward Ptarmigan Lake, visible in the distance. David stared for a long time, remembering, processing. "I don't think I'll ever hike that trail again," he said quietly. Margaret squeezed his hand. "You don't have to. You can love this place without going back there." David nodded. "I'm starting to understand that. I can appreciate the wilderness, can support its protection, can value what it represents, without physically returning to it. Maybe that's enough." They stood together, looking at mountains that had been David's workplace for 17 years, at wild country that remained wild, dangerous, beautiful, indifferent to human concerns, and David felt a complex mix of emotions he didn't try to untangle, simply allowing himself to feel them, all the grief and gratitude and loss and love that this place now represented. David Collins' story was ultimately one of survival against overwhelming odds, of a man who had been given what should have been a death sentence, and who had instead clawed his way back to life through his own determination, the skill of medical professionals, the love of his family, and a significant measure of chance and fortune. He would carry the physical and psychological scars of August 12, 2024 for the rest of his life, would never fully recover from injuries so catastrophic, would never be who he was before the attack. But he was alive, and he was building a new life from the ruins of the old, finding new purposes, new ways of contributing, new understanding of what mattered. His children would grow up with their father present, damaged but present, rather than growing up with only memories. His wife would grow old with him, supporting him through challenges but having him there to support her in return. He would see grandchildren, would experience joys and sorrows that would have been impossible if Roger Simmons hadn't scared the bear away when he did, if the DHART helicopter had arrived 5 minutes later, if any of a dozen small factors had been different. His survival was improbable, a series of fortunate circumstances aligning at critical moments, but it was also testament to human resilience, to the extraordinary capabilities of modern medicine, to the bonds of family and community that sustained people through unimaginable hardship. The wilderness of Glacier National Park would remain long after David Collins and everyone involved in his story were gone. The mountains and glaciers and forests operating on time frames measured in millennia rather than human lifespans. The grizzly bears would continue to roam these mountains, would continue occasionally to encounter humans, would continue to be both magnificent examples of wild nature and serious dangers to people who entered their territory unprepared or unlucky. The question of how humans and bears could coexist in shared landscapes would continue to challenge wildlife managers, policymakers, and wilderness users. David's attack provided data points, lessons, cautionary examples that might help inform better practices and reduce similar incidents, but it could not eliminate risk entirely, could not make wilderness completely safe, because wilderness by its very nature was not safe, was defined partly by its wildness, its unpredictability, its indifference to human desires for control and safety. People who chose to enter wilderness, whether as visitors or as rangers charged with protecting it, accepted risks that occasionally materialized in tragic ways. David had understood and accepted those risks throughout his career. That they had manifested so catastrophically on August 12, 2024, was not his fault, was not anyone's fault, was simply the confluence of circumstances that occasionally turned deadly in wild places. His survival, his recovery, his ongoing work to educate others and prevent similar incidents was his response to that reality. His attempt to wrest meaning from suffering, to contribute something valuable from an experience that had taken so much from him. As years passed, David Collins would gradually recede from public attention, his story becoming one of many bear attack incidents recorded in Park Service archives, discussed in occasional training sessions, referenced in safety literature but no longer headline news. He would live his life, changed but continuing, building new routines and finding new equilibriums, managing limitations and celebrating small victories. The attack would define him in many ways, would be the central event that divided his life into before and after, but it would not be the only thing that defined him. He would also be defined by his resilience, by his family, by his contributions to education and safety, by the ordinary moments of grace and joy that comprise any life. The night of August 12, 2024, when he'd lain in the ICU more dead than alive, would become part of his history rather than his entire story, a chapter in a longer narrative that continued to unfold, that he had a continuing story at all, rather than having his life end at age 42 on a lakeshore in Montana, was the fundamental miracle of his survival, one he would never take for granted and would continue to honor by living as fully as his limitations allowed, grateful for every additional day he'd been granted. The next stories. Grizzly bear kills 2 hikers in 14 minutes. December 11th, 2024, the morning of December 8th, 2024, broke cold and clear over Whitefish, Montana, a small mountain town nestled 40 miles from the western entrance to Glacier National Park. Daniel Carter stood in the driveway of his rented cabin, breath misting in the 18-degree air, loading the last of the camping gear into his dark blue Toyota 4Runner. The vehicle's thermometer read 7:23 a.m., and already he could hear his younger sister Laura moving around inside, the sound of her hiking boots on the wooden floor carrying through the thin walls of the rental property they'd secured through Airbnb 3 months earlier. Daniel was 29 years old, tall and lean at 6'2", with the wiry build of someone who spent more time running mountain trails than sitting in offices. His sandy brown hair was cut short, practical for the outdoors, and his face bore the weathered look of someone who genuinely lived for these expeditions. He worked as a civil engineer in Portland, Oregon, but his real passion had always been the wilderness, the places where cell phones didn't work, and the only sounds were wind through pines and water over stone. Laura emerged from the cabin carrying 2 stuff sacks, her long dark hair pulled back in a practical braid. At 26, she was a graduate student at the University of Washington, studying environmental science with a focus on large predator conservation. She was shorter than her brother at 5'6", with their mother's dark eyes and their father's determined jawline. She'd been the one to suggest this trip, texting Daniel back in September with a simple message that read, "Early winter in Glacier. Just us. Like old times." Daniel had agreed immediately, both of them needing the escape, both of them carrying weights that only the wilderness seemed capable of lifting, at least temporarily. Their father, Robert Carter, had died in March of that year, a sudden heart attack at 61 that had left the entire family reeling. Robert had been the one who'd introduced them to backpacking, starting when Daniel was 7 and Laura was 4, taking them on increasingly ambitious trips throughout the Pacific Northwest as they grew older. Some of Daniel's most vivid memories were of his father teaching him to read topographic maps, to identify animal tracks, to understand that the wilderness demanded respect, but offered something irreplaceable in return. Laura's interest in wildlife biology had been born on those trips, sparked by a close encounter with a black bear in the Cascades when she was 12, watching through binoculars as the animal foraged for berries, utterly magnificent and completely indifferent to their presence. Their mother, Patricia, had stayed home, preferring her garden and her book club, but she'd always encouraged the trips, understanding that this was how the 3 of them connected. After Robert's death, Patricia had sold the family home in Spokane and moved to a small condo in Seattle to be closer to Laura. Daniel and Laura had scattered some of their father's ashes on Mount Rainier in July, at a campsite where they'd spent a week when Daniel was 16, but both of them felt like they needed something more, some longer pilgrimage to properly honor his memory. The plan for this trip was ambitious but manageable, at least on paper. They would spend 5 days in the backcountry, hiking a route that Daniel had plotted carefully on his worn copy of the Glacier National Park trail map. The route would take them from the Two Medicine area on the eastern side of the park, up through a series of valleys and over a high pass, eventually connecting with trails that would loop them back to a different trailhead where they'd arranged to leave Laura's silver Honda CR-V as their exit vehicle. Total distance, approximately 48 miles. Total elevation gain, roughly 12,000 feet. It was December, which meant the park was essentially empty, most of the maintained trails and facilities closed for the season, but that was exactly what they wanted. Solitude. Silence. The kind of experience that was increasingly rare, even in places as vast as Glacier. They'd obtained the necessary backcountry permits, filed their itinerary with the Park Service, and prepared meticulously. Daniel had been backpacking through winter conditions for over a decade. Laura, while less experienced in winter camping specifically, was physically fit and mentally tough, plus she had the academic background to understand the risks they were taking, particularly regarding wildlife. Bears were the primary concern, though in December most grizzlies in the region should have been denned up for hibernation. Should have been, being the operative phrase, as Laura had reminded Daniel multiple times during their planning. Climate change was disrupting traditional hibernation patterns. Warmer autumns meant more available food later in the season, and some bears, particularly younger males and pregnant females who hadn't accumulated sufficient fat reserves, were staying active longer. Laura had pulled up several recent studies showing delayed denning times across the northern continental divide ecosystem, the vast wilderness area that included Glacier National Park and the Bob Marshall Wilderness Complex. One paper from Montana State University documented grizzlies remaining active well into January in some years, especially if there were unusual food sources available. Daniel had read the papers she'd sent him, taken the information seriously, and adjusted their planning accordingly. They'd rented 2 bear canisters for their food storage, even though the park didn't strictly require them in December. They'd packed bear spray, 2 canisters each, wearing them on their hip belts, where they could be accessed in seconds. They'd reviewed proper camping protocols, the importance of cooking away from their tent, the need to hang or canister all scented items, the value of making noise while hiking. But there was something else too, something neither of them articulated directly. A part of both Daniel and Laura wanted to see a bear, wanted that encounter with something wild and powerful, as long as it remained at a safe distance. It was the paradox at the heart of all wilderness travel in grizzly country. The bears were both the greatest threat and the main attraction, the thing you feared and the thing you most hoped to witness. Laura had dedicated her academic career to understanding these animals, to advocating for their protection and their habitat, but she'd only seen grizzlies from vehicles or at extreme distances. Daniel had encountered black bears dozens of times, but had never seen a grizzly in the wild. Their father had seen one years ago in Yellowstone, a massive male that had crossed the trail 100 yards ahead, and Robert had talked about that sighting for the rest of his life with an awe that Daniel had found almost religious in its intensity. The drive from Whitefish to the Two Medicine entrance took just over an hour. Highway 2 cutting through the early morning darkness, their headlights illuminating patches of snow along the roadside. The radio played quietly, a mix of indie folk that Laura had queued up on her phone, both of them mostly silent, that comfortable quiet that only exists between people who know each other deeply. They passed through East Glacier Park Village at 8:47 a.m., the small tourist town shuttered and sleeping in the off-season. Only a gas station and a single diner showing signs of life. Daniel filled up the tank, while Laura went inside to use the bathroom and buy coffee, returning with 2 large cups and a bag of donuts that they ate while continuing north on Route 49. The eastern face of the Rockies rising before them, massive and snow-covered and almost painfully beautiful in the morning light. Two Medicine Valley was completely deserted when they arrived at 9:31 a.m. The main parking area was empty except for 2 Park Service vehicles and a single civilian pickup truck that looked like it belonged to maintenance staff. The visitor center was closed, windows dark, a weathered sign indicating it wouldn't reopen until late May. Daniel parked at the trailhead parking area, a small lot that in summer would have been packed with day hikers and tourists, but now held only their 4Runner and the sound of wind moving through lodgepole pines. The temperature had climbed to 23 degrees, and the sky was a hard, brilliant blue, not a cloud visible in any direction. They spent 30 minutes gearing up, spreading their packs on the tailgate, doing final equipment checks, discussing one more time whether they had everything they needed. Daniel's pack weighed 48 pounds, fully loaded with 5 days of food, winter sleeping bag, 4-season tent, stove, fuel, water filter, extra clothing layers, emergency kit, first aid supplies, and all the small items that added up quickly. Laura's pack was slightly lighter at 42 pounds, her winter sleeping bag a newer model that used advanced insulation technology to save weight. Both of them wore layers, synthetic base layers, fleece mid-layers, waterproof shells in their packs for when weather turned. Their boots were heavy-duty winter hikers, rated to -20 degrees, and they each carried micro-spikes and trekking poles strapped to their packs. At 10:17 a.m., they locked the Forerunner, Daniel hiding the keys under a magnetic case attached to the frame, and they set off up the trail. The two Medicine Area trails were officially closed for the season, but not gated or barred, simply unmanaged and unmaintained, used at your own risk. The trail they followed, which would eventually take them up toward Pitamarkan Pass, started by paralleling the shore of Two Medicine Lake, the water dark and cold and partially frozen along its edges. Their boots crunched on packed snow, their breath visible in the cold air, and within 15 minutes, both of them had fallen into the rhythm of the trail, that meditative state where thought quiets and the body simply moves, step after step, the pack's weight settling into hips and shoulders, trekking poles clicking against stone and ice. The first day was meant to be relatively easy, only 7 miles with modest elevation gain, ending at a campsite near Oldman Lake that Daniel had identified on the map. They'd have plenty of daylight, plenty of time to set up a good camp, practice their winter camping systems, and acclimate to the altitude and the conditions. The trail climbed gradually through mixed forest, stands of lodgepole pine and subalpine fir, the trees becoming shorter and more twisted as they gained elevation. They saw tracks in the snow, deer, and what might have been a mountain lion, but no sign of bears. Laura stopped frequently to photograph the landscape, pulling out her phone despite the cold affecting the battery, wanting to document everything. Daniel found himself narrating parts of the trail to himself, imagining how he'd describe it to their father, then feeling the sharp pang of remembering that such conversations were no longer possible. They stopped for lunch at 12:40 p.m. near a frozen creek, sitting on their foam pads on top of a flat rock, eating energy bars and trail mix, sharing a thermos of hot tea that Laura had prepared that morning. "You doing okay?" Laura asked, watching Daniel's face as he stared out at the valley below them. "Yeah," he said, then more honestly, "mostly." "You?" I keep thinking he should be here," she said, "like we should have 3 packs, not 2. "I know," Daniel said, "but I think he'd be happy we're doing this." "I think he'd be telling us we're idiots for coming out here in December," Laura said, smiling slightly. "Probably," Daniel agreed, "but he'd also be having the time of his life." They reached Oldman Lake at 3:22 p.m., the light already starting to fade, sunset coming early this far north in early winter. The lake was completely frozen, a perfect oval of white surrounded by steep mountains, and the designated camping area was empty, deep in snow. They spent 40 minutes setting up camp, choosing a spot in a small stand of trees that offered some wind protection, stomping down the snow to create a platform for their tent, organizing their camp kitchen in a triangle pattern 30 yards from where they'd sleep. Daniel melted snow for water, while Laura prepared their dinner, freeze-dried chicken and rice that tasted far better than it had any right to after a day of hiking. They ate in their tent as the temperature dropped, both of them in their full sleeping bag systems by 7 p.m., reading by headlamp, talking occasionally, falling asleep to the profound silence that only exists in deep winter in high mountains. The second day, December 9th, they woke to find 6 inches of fresh snow had fallen overnight, transforming the landscape into something even more pristine and otherworldly. Daniel's thermometer read 11 degrees at 6:30 a.m. when he crawled out of the tent to start melting snow for coffee and breakfast. The sky was clear again, stars still visible, and he stood for a long moment in the pre-dawn darkness, breath steaming, listening to absolutely nothing, the kind of silence that felt almost sacred. Laura emerged 20 minutes later, and they went through their morning routine, eating oatmeal with dried fruit and nuts, breaking down camp, repacking their bags with cold, stiffened fingers. They were hiking by 8:45 a.m., following the trail as it climbed more steeply now, switchbacking up through increasingly sparse forest toward Pitamakan Pass. This was the most technically demanding section of their route, gaining over 2,000 feet in less than 4 miles, and the fresh snow made the footing tricky, requiring them to move carefully, testing each step. They reached the pass at 1:13 p.m., both of them exhausted and exhilarated, standing at 7,600 feet with views that extended for what seemed like 100 miles in every direction. The wind was fierce at the pass, gusting hard enough that they had to lean into it. But the visibility was extraordinary. Daniel pulled out his map and compass, orienting himself, pointing out various peaks and valleys to Laura. They could see deep into the heart of the park, ridge after ridge of snow-covered mountains stretching away to the west. This was genuine wilderness, the kind of landscape that had looked essentially the same for thousands of years. And standing there, Daniel felt something ease in his chest, some tension he'd been carrying since March, finally starting to release. They ate a quick lunch, huddled behind a wind-sheltering rock, then began the descent down the western side of the pass, following a trail that dropped into the North Fork of Cutbank Creek drainage. The campsite that night was at a place called Morning Star Lake, though calling it a lake was generous given that it was more of a tarn, a small alpine pond completely frozen and drifted over with snow. They arrived at 4:47 p.m., with maybe 40 minutes of usable daylight remaining, and set up camp quickly, repeating the previous night's routine but with more confidence, their systems already becoming familiar. That night was colder, dropping to 6 degrees by the time they went to sleep, but both of them were warm in their bags, and the tent was solid and reassuring. Daniel lay awake for a while, listening to Laura's breathing deepen into sleep, thinking about the fact that they were now truly in the back country, at least 10 miles from the nearest maintained road, in conditions where a serious injury or a major weather event could become life-threatening very quickly. But he didn't feel afraid, not exactly. He felt alert, present, alive in a way that normal life rarely allowed. He fell asleep sometime after 9 p.m., his dreams a confused mixture of memories and mountain landscapes. December 10th brought a significant weather change. They woke to clouds, thick and low, and a temperature that had actually risen overnight to 27 degrees, which seemed warm after the previous days, but also suggested incoming precipitation. Daniel checked his InReach satellite communicator, a device he'd brought specifically for its weather forecasting capability, and found a winter storm warning had been issued for the region, with heavy snow expected to begin that afternoon and continue through the next day. They discussed their options over breakfast. They could stay put, weather out the storm at their current location, then continue when it passed. They could turn back, retracing their route over Pitamakan Pass and exiting the way they'd come in, or they could push forward, trying to cover as much ground as possible before the weather hit, potentially reaching a more sheltered location. Laura was in favor of pushing forward. Daniel was more cautious, but ultimately agreed, and they were hiking by 8:15 a.m., moving fast, eating energy bars on the trail instead of stopping for proper lunch, trying to put miles behind them. The trail followed Cutbank Creek downstream, losing elevation steadily, passing through beautiful subalpine terrain that neither of them had much time to appreciate, given their pace and the deteriorating weather. The first snow started falling at 11:32 a.m., light at first, then steadily heavier. By 1 p.m. visibility had dropped to maybe 100 yards, and by 2:30 p.m. they were essentially hiking through a whiteout, following the trail by instinct and GPS more than any visible markers. Daniel was navigating with his GPS unit, checking their position every 15 minutes, while Laura focused on the immediate terrain ahead, watching for hazards. They were both tired, the pace of the day taking its toll, and the temperature was dropping again as the storm intensified. At 3:47 p.m., they reached a decision point on the trail, a junction where their planned route would have taken them west toward Upper Park Creek and eventually toward the interior of the park. But the storm was now fully established, with snow falling so heavily that they couldn't see more than 50 feet in any direction, and Daniel made the call to modify their plan. There was a ranger patrol cabin marked on the map, located down in the Cutbank Creek Valley, about 2 miles off their intended route. The cabin was unoccupied during winter, but park policy allowed backcountry travelers to use it in emergency situations. This felt like it might qualify, and both of them liked the idea of having 4 solid walls and a roof over their heads, while the storm dumped what forecast predicted would be 18 to 30 inches of snow over the next 36 hours. They reached the cabin at 5:23 p.m., working their way down a faint trail through heavy timber, almost missing the structure entirely in the storm and fading light before Laura spotted the outline of the building through the snow. The cabin was small, maybe 12 feet by 16 feet, built of rough-hewn logs with a metal roof and a single door facing south. The door was unlocked, standard practice for emergency shelters, and they pushed inside gratefully, stomping snow off their boots, dropping their packs. The interior was sparse but functional. 2 wooden bunk beds with thin mattresses, a small wood stove, a simple table, and 2 chairs, some basic emergency supplies in a wooden box on one wall. There was no firewood stocked, but Daniel found a small cache of split logs behind the cabin, protected under a tarp, enough to keep the stove going through one night at least. They spent the next hour getting organized, hanging wet clothes to dry, preparing dinner, starting a fire in the stove that quickly warmed the small space to something approaching comfortable. By 7 p.m. they were sitting at the table eating hot food, playing cards by headlamp, listening to the wind howl outside, and feeling incredibly fortunate to have made the decision to come here rather than trying to camp in the storm. "We might be here for 2 nights, Daniel said, studying the weather forecast on his inReach. "This storm is supposed to last through tomorrow, maybe into Friday morning." "That's fine," Laura said. "We've got food, we're warm, and honestly, after the last few days, I could use a rest day." They slept well that night, the cabin holding heat from the wood stove, the sound of wind and snow against the roof, somehow more comforting than threatening with solid walls around them. Daniel got up twice during the night to add wood to the stove, peering out the cabin's small window each time to see nothing but swirling snow and darkness. The storm was living up to its billing, dumping snow at what looked like 2 inches per hour. December 11th began the same way, with heavy snow still falling when Daniel woke at 6:47 a.m. The storm had deposited at least 16 inches overnight, maybe more, and it showed no signs of letting up. They had a lazy morning, rationing their food since they'd likely be there another full day, melting snow for water on the wood stove, reading, talking, at one point playing a lengthy game of 20 questions that devolved into laughter when Laura successfully guessed that Daniel was thinking of a wolverine by asking increasingly specific questions about mating habits and aggressive behavior. Around 11 a.m., Daniel decided to make a quick trip outside to gather more firewood from the cache behind the cabin, figuring they'd need it if they were going to be there through another night. He pulled on his jacket and boots, grabbed his gloves, and stepped out into the storm. The wind hit him immediately, a gust that nearly knocked him sideways, and the snow was coming down so heavily he could barely see the back corner of the cabin. He made his way around to the woodpile, loaded his arms with 4 logs, and was turning to head back when he saw the tracks. They were fresh, filling with snow even as he looked at them, but still clearly visible, cutting across the small clearing behind the cabin. Bear tracks. Huge bear tracks. Each print was at least 10 inches long, with visible claw marks extending another 4 inches beyond the pad impressions. Daniel stood frozen, logs in his arms, snow pelting his face, his mind trying to process what he was seeing. A grizzly, here, active, in December, in the middle of a blizzard. The tracks came from the forest to the north, passed within maybe 15 feet of the back wall of the cabin, and continued south toward the creek. They were so fresh that the edges hadn't collapsed at all, meaning the bear had passed by within the last few minutes, possibly while Daniel was still inside. He dropped the logs and ran back to the cabin door, his heart hammering, burst inside with snow swirling in behind him. Laura looked up from her book, startled by his entrance, and immediately knew something was wrong from the expression on his face. "There's a bear," Daniel said, breathing hard, not from exertion but from adrenaline. Grizzly tracks right behind the cabin. Fresh, like within the last 5 minutes, fresh. Laura was on her feet instantly, moving to the window, trying to see out into the whiteout. "How big?" "Huge," Daniel said. "Biggest tracks I've ever seen." They stood together at the window watching, but visibility was so poor they couldn't see anything beyond maybe 30 feet. The tracks had been there, Daniel was certain of that, but in this storm, a bear could be 20 yards away and they'd never see it. Laura pulled out her phone, opened the wildlife tracking app she'd installed for her research, and started reading aloud about grizzly behavior in winter. "Delayed denning is increasingly common," she read, "particularly in male bears who haven't accumulated sufficient fat reserves. Pregnant females sometimes delay denning if they haven't reached a critical body weight threshold. Once denned, bears can emerge temporarily during warm spells or weather events." She looked up at Daniel. "This storm might have pushed it out of a den, or it might have never denned in the first place." "What do we do?" Daniel asked. "We stay inside," Laura said immediately. "We make sure all our food is secured. We don't do anything to attract it, and we wait for it to move on." They spent the next 2 hours essentially barricaded in the cabin, taking turns, watching out the window, listening for any sounds outside, jumping at every creak of the building settling or branch snapping under snow load. At 1:22 p.m., Daniel looked out and saw fresh tracks again, this time crossing in front of the cabin, close enough that he could have touched the prints if he'd opened the door. The bear was circling them, investigating, trying to understand what this structure was and whether it contained anything of interest. They checked their food storage. Everything was in the bear canisters, sealed tight, but they both knew that bears had an incredible sense of smell, could detect scents at concentrations humans couldn't even imagine. Had the bear smelled them? Smelled their food? Was it just curious, or was it hungry, desperate, looking for anything that might help it survive? At 2:18 p.m., they heard something hit the side of the cabin, a heavy thump that shook the entire structure. Laura gasped, grabbing Daniel's arm. They stood frozen, listening, and then heard it again, the unmistakable sound of something large pushing against the cabin wall, testing it, exploring. The bear was right there, separated from them by only 4 inches of old-growth logs. Daniel could hear its breathing now, heavy and wet, could hear the sound of claws scraping against wood. The sounds moved along the wall, toward the door, and both of them stared at the simple wooden door with its simple metal latch, realizing simultaneously how inadequate it was, how easily a grizzly could destroy it if it really wanted to. The door rattled, the latch shaking, and Laura moved without thinking, grabbing the table and dragging it toward the door, Daniel joining her, the two of them pushing the table against the door, bracing it, then pulling one of the bunk beds over as well, creating a barricade. The bear pushed against the door once more, hard enough that the barricade shifted an inch, and then nothing. Silence. They waited, breathing hard, listening, and after what felt like an eternity but was probably only 3 or 4 minutes, Daniel cautiously moved to the window and looked out. The snow was still falling heavily, but he could see tracks leading away from the cabin, heading south again. The bear had moved on. "Okay," Daniel said, his voice shaky. "Okay, it's gone." "For now," Laura said, "but it knows we're here." It's interested. We need to leave. In this storm, Daniel said. Laura, visibility is 0. We'd get lost in 10 minutes. I know, she said, but we can't stay here with that thing circling. What if it comes back tonight? What if it's hungrier next time? They argued for the next hour, both of them scared, both of them right in different ways. Leaving in the storm was dangerous, potentially fatal if they got lost or injured. Staying meant being trapped in a small cabin with a clearly habituated or desperate grizzly investigating them repeatedly. Finally, they reached a compromise. They would wait until the storm showed any sign of letting up, the moment visibility improved even slightly. They would pack everything and make a run for it, heading back the way they'd come, trying to put distance between themselves and this location. In the meantime, they would keep watch, keep their bear spray readily accessible, and be prepared to leave at a moment's notice. The storm did not let up. If anything, it intensified through the afternoon, the wind howling louder, the snow falling harder. At 4:33 p.m., the light outside starting to fade toward evening, they heard the bear again, this time on the roof. The sound of something massive moving across the metal roof was terrifying, and they stood below, watching the ceiling, half expecting it to cave in under the weight. The bear stayed up there for several minutes, and they could hear it sniffing, could hear the scrape of claws on metal. Then it was gone again, and they were left in the gathering darkness, too frightened to even eat dinner, both of them clutching their bear spray, watching the door and windows. At 6:47 p.m., Daniel made a decision. They couldn't stay there. Storm or no storm, darkness or no darkness. They had to leave. The bear was not moving on. It was fixated on the cabin, on them, and every time it came back it seemed more persistent, more interested. They packed by headlamp, moving quickly, stuffing everything into their packs without bothering with their usual organization, getting their layers on, their gloves, their shell jackets. Daniel pulled up the GPS coordinates for the 2 Medicine trailhead on his GPS unit, calculated the bearing and distance, 11.4 miles, bearing of roughly 085 degrees. They could follow that bearing, even in a whiteout, and eventually hit the trail they'd come in on, follow it back to the trailhead and their vehicle. At 7:04 p.m., they moved the barricade away from the door, both of them breathing hard from fear and adrenaline. Daniel had his bear spray in his right hand, canister aimed forward, safety off. Laura had hers in her left hand, her right hand holding a trekking pole. They opened the door, headlamps cutting through swirling snow, and stepped out into the storm. The temperature had dropped again, probably down around 5 degrees, and with the wind chill, it felt far colder. They could barely see 10 feet ahead, but they could see the tracks, see where the bear had been circling, and they moved quickly away from the cabin, heading northeast, following Daniel's compass bearing. They hiked through darkness and snow, moving as fast as they dared, which wasn't very fast at all given the conditions. Daniel was navigating by compass and GPS, checking their position every few minutes, trying to keep them on course. Laura was behind him, close enough to touch, both of them using trekking poles to probe ahead for obstacles or drop-offs. The storm was disorienting, the wind and snow creating a kind of sensory deprivation, and several times Daniel had to stop, reorient himself, check and double-check their position because his internal sense of direction kept insisting they were going the wrong way. After 45 minutes, they'd covered maybe a mile, and both of them were already exhausted, the deep snow and steep terrain, and the constant tension draining them rapidly. At 7:52 p.m., Laura screamed. Daniel spun around, bear spray up, and his headlamp illuminated the bear. It was 30 feet behind them, massive and dark against the snow, standing on all fours, head lowered, watching them. Daniel had never seen anything so large. The bear stood at least 4 feet tall at the shoulder, and he estimated it would be close to 8 feet tall if it stood on its hind legs. It was a male, definitely, with the characteristic shoulder hump and huge blocky head of a mature male grizzly, and it was staring directly at them. "Don't run," Daniel said quietly, his voice amazingly steady despite the terror coursing through him. "Back away slowly. Get your bear spray ready." They began to back away, moving together, keeping their eyes on the bear, and the bear followed. It didn't charge, didn't vocalize, just walked after them, matching their pace, maintaining that 30-foot distance. This was stalking behavior, Daniel realized with a sick feeling. This was predatory behavior. The bear wasn't trying to defend territory or cubs. It was following them deliberately, testing them, maybe trying to figure out if they were potential prey. "We need to make ourselves big, make noise," Laura said, her voice tight with fear. "Everything I've read says you need to assert yourself, not act like prey." They stopped backing up, stood their ground, and Daniel raised his arms over his head, making himself as tall as possible. He shouted at the bear, his voice swallowed almost immediately by the wind and snow, and Laura did the same, both of them yelling, trying to appear intimidating. The bear stopped watching, and for a moment Daniel thought it might work, thought the animal might decide they weren't worth the trouble and leave. Then the bear took 2 steps forward, closing the distance, and Daniel made the hardest decision of his life. "Run!" he said. "Laura, run! Now!" They ran. Both of them knew it was the wrong thing to do, knew that running triggered prey drive in predators, but the alternative was standing there and letting the bear close the distance, and neither of them could do that. They crashed through the snow, Daniel slightly ahead, Laura right behind, both of them stumbling, falling, getting up, running again. Daniel could hear the bear behind them, could hear the sound of it moving through the snow, and he knew with absolute certainty that they couldn't outrun it, that grizzlies could sprint at 30 miles per hour, even through snow, that this was going to end one way only. He was right. The bear caught Laura first. Daniel heard her scream, a sound that would haunt him for the rest of his life, and he turned to see the bear on top of her, massive, dark, moving with horrible speed and power. Laura had fallen or been knocked down, and the bear was biting at her pack, shaking her like a dog with a toy. Daniel didn't think, didn't hesitate, ran back toward them, unsafety his bear spray, and unleashing a full burst directly into the bear's face from maybe 8 feet away. The orange spray was visible in his headlamp, a cloud of concentrated capsaicin, and it hit the bear directly in the eyes and nose. The bear released Laura and turned on Daniel, bellowing in pain and rage, and charged. Daniel got off one more spray before the bear hit him, 500 pounds or more of muscle and fury, and then he was on the ground, the bear on top of him, and he felt pain like nothing he'd ever imagined. The bear's jaws closed on his left shoulder, teeth punching through his jacket and shirt and skin like they weren't even there, grinding against bone, and Daniel screamed, tried to fight, tried to push the animal off, but he might as well have been trying to push away a truck. The bear shook him, his entire body ragdolling, and then released him, bit down on his right leg, shook again, and Daniel felt his femur snap, felt the bone break like dry wood. Then the bear was gone, vanished back into the storm, and Daniel lay in the snow, his left shoulder a mass of torn tissue and exposed muscle, his right leg bent at an impossible angle, blood soaking into the snow around him. He could hear Laura crying somewhere nearby, and he tried to move toward her, managed to drag himself maybe 3 feet before the pain became so overwhelming that darkness rushed in from the edges of his vision, and he nearly passed out. "Laura," he managed to say, his voice weak. "Laura, are you okay?" "My back," she said, her voice high and tight with pain. "Daniel, my back. I can't feel my legs." Daniel closed his eyes, felt hot tears track down his frozen face, and tried to think. They were 11 miles from the trailhead, in the middle of a blizzard, in darkness, with injuries that were almost certainly fatal without immediate medical attention. Laura had a spinal injury. He had massive trauma to his shoulder and a compound fracture of his femur. They had no way to call for help. The storm would block any satellite signals from his in-reach, and even if they could send an SOS, no helicopter could fly in these conditions. They were going to die here. The bear was going to come back, or they were going to bleed out, or they were going to freeze to death, and there was nothing he could do to prevent any of those outcomes. "I'm sorry," he said to Laura, not sure if she could hear him. "I'm so sorry. This is my fault." "Not your fault," Laura said, and even through the pain he could hear the love in her voice. "Not your fault, Daniel. I love you." "I love you too," he said. And then the bear returned. It came from the darkness, a massive shape in his peripheral vision, and this time there was no hesitation, no testing, no stalking. The bear went straight for Laura, and her screams cut through the storm, shrill and terrible and mercifully brief. Daniel watched, helpless, as the bear killed his sister, and then it turned back to him, blood on its muzzle, and he thought, this is it. This is how it ends. But the bear didn't attack again. It stood over him, looking down, and then moved away, disappearing into the snow and darkness, leaving Daniel alone with his pain and his grief and the body of his sister 10 feet away. He tried to stay conscious, tried to keep thinking, but it was so cold and he was so tired. His blood was freezing in the snow around him, forming dark crystals, and he realized distantly that he was going into shock, that his body was shutting down, that he had minutes left maybe, not hours. He thought about his father, wondered if there was anything after death, hoped that if there was then maybe he'd see Robert again soon, and Laura too, and they could be together, the three of them, the way they were supposed to be. The storm continued, indifferent to the tragedy playing out below, snow falling steadily, covering the tracks, covering the blood, covering Daniel's body as his breathing slowed, then stopped, his last conscious thought a confused mixture of regret and relief, and then nothing at all, just the wind and the snow and the cold darkness of a December night in the wilderness. The alarm at Glacier National Park headquarters in West Glacier, Montana, went off at 8:47 a.m. on December 12, 2024, triggered when Daniel Carter's InReach satellite communicator sent an automatic SOS signal. The device had a feature that would send an emergency beacon if it detected no movement for 12 consecutive hours, assuming the wearer was incapacitated and that threshold had just been reached. The signal was received by GEOS, International Emergency Response Coordination Center in Houston, Texas, which immediately contacted the National Park Service Dispatch Center, which in turn contacted the Flathead County Sheriff's Office Search and Rescue Coordinator Jerry Weston, who was sitting in his office in Kalispell, drinking his second coffee of the morning when his phone rang. "This is Weston," he said, answering on the second ring. "Jerry, it's Amanda at Park Service Dispatch. We've got an SOS beacon activation in the Cutbank drainage. Coordinates are being sent to your system now. 2 hikers, registered permits, show Daniel and Laura Carter, siblings from Oregon and Washington, 5-day backcountry trip, should have been on day 4. Beacon shows no movement in 12 hours. Jerry pulled up the coordinates on his computer, looked at the location, looked at the weather radar showing a massive storm system that had dumped over 2 feet of snow across that entire region in the last 36 hours, and felt his stomach drop. Those coordinates are 11 miles from the nearest trailhead, in some of the most remote backcountry in the park. With this storm, we can't get a helicopter in there. "I know," Amanda said. "We're looking at a ground rescue, and we're looking at it being potentially multi-day given the conditions." "Give me an hour," Jerry said. "I'll make some calls, get a team together." "But Amanda, if they've been down for 12 hours in these conditions, even if we find them today, they're probably not going to be alive." "I know," Amanda said quietly, "but we have to try." Jerry spent the next 90 minutes making calls, assembling a rescue team, coordinating with the Park Service and with Montana Search and Rescue. The team that eventually gathered at the 2 Medicine Ranger Station at 11:35 a.m. consisted of 8 people, 4 Park Service Rangers, 3 County Search and Rescue volunteers, and 1 emergency medical technician from Kalispell Regional Medical Center. The EMT was a woman named Sarah Chen, 34 years old, who'd been doing wilderness rescue for 6 years and had seen more than her share of bad outcomes. The team was led by Dave Martinez, a Park Service Ranger who'd worked in Glacier for 12 years and knew the backcountry as well as anyone alive. "Conditions are shit," Dave said bluntly, briefing the team in the ranger station while they geared up. 2 feet of new snow. Avalanche danger is considerable to high in the Alpine, and we've got another system moving in tonight that's supposed to drop another foot. We're going to have to snowshoe in, which means we're looking at maybe 2 miles an hour if we're lucky. The beacon coordinates put our subjects in the cut bank drainage, approximately 11 miles from this location. That's a minimum of 5 hours to reach them. Probably more like 7 or 8 in these conditions, and then the same amount of time to get back out if we can't get a helicopter in for extraction. "What's the survival window?" asked one of the volunteers, a man named Rick Torres, who ran a guide service in the summer and did search and rescue in the winter. "If they're injured and exposed?" "They should have been dead hours ago," Sarah Chen said bluntly. "If they have shelter, if they're in their tent with sleeping bags, if they're uninjured, then we might have a chance, but an SOS beacon with no movement for 12 hours doesn't suggest that scenario." "Recovery operation then," Dave said. "We're going in prepared to find bodies. Sarah, you're still coming. We'll need medical confirmation of death for the paperwork. Everyone else, this is going to be long and cold and ugly, and we might not even find them if the snow's covered everything. But we're going in anyway because that's the job." They set out at 12:14 p.m., 8 people on snowshoes carrying overnight packs with winter camping gear, medical supplies, rescue equipment and body bags. The storm had cleared slightly. Visibility was up to maybe a quarter mile, but the snow was deep and heavy, and the going was slow. Dave navigated, checking GPS every 15 minutes, keeping them on course while everyone else focused on just moving forward, 1 step at a time, snowshoes sinking deep even with the flotation they provided. They were following the trail that Daniel and Laura should have used to exit the area, hoping to intercept their route, hoping to find some sign of them. After 3 hours, they'd covered maybe 6 miles, and Dave called for a rest break. Everyone was exhausted, breathing hard in the thin, cold air. And Sarah checked on each team member, looking for signs of hypothermia or exhaustion. Everyone was okay, tired but functional, and they continued. The light was starting to fade already, the sun setting early, and Dave made the decision to continue through darkness, everyone switching on headlamps, the beams of light cutting through the snowy landscape in eerie shafts. At 6:38 p.m., they found the cabin. Dave recognized it immediately, the patrol cabin in the cutbank drainage, and immediately altered their route to check it. The cabin door was hanging open, snow drifted inside, and there were signs of recent occupation. A cold wood stove with ashes, food wrappers, equipment scattered on the bunks. Dave found the hiker's permit folder where it had fallen under one of the bunks, confirmed these were Daniel and Laura Carter's belongings, and radioed back to dispatch. "We've got their camp," he reported. "They were using the patrol cabin, but they're not here, and it looks like they left in a hurry." Door was open, gear scattered, no indication of what happened. "Any signs of wildlife?" Amanda asked from dispatch. Dave stepped back outside, played his headlamp across the snow around the cabin, and went very still. "Yeah," he said slowly. "Yeah, we've got bear tracks, big ones, all around the cabin, and drag marks leading south. The team followed the drag marks, moving carefully. everyone now acutely aware that there was a grizzly bear in the area. A bear that had apparently been investigating the cabin, possibly interacting with the hikers. The tracks and marks led them south through heavy timber for about 200 yards. And then they found Laura. Her body was partially buried in snow, but visible enough. She was on her back, her pack still on, and the damage was extensive. Sarah Chen, who'd thought herself immune to shock after years of medical work, stood for a moment just looking, processing, then moved forward to do her job. She confirmed death, obvious from the injuries, and began documenting everything with photos and written notes. The cause of death was clear: massive trauma consistent with a large predator attack. Sarah counted at least 6 separate bite wounds, multiple claw marks, evidence of a sustained attack. "Where's the brother?" Rick Torres asked, playing his headlamp around the area. They found Daniel 300 yards further south, his body face down in the snow, frozen solid. The injuries were similar to Laura's but more concentrated, focused on his left shoulder and right leg. Sarah confirmed he'd died from a combination of trauma and blood loss. His femur was shattered, his shoulder essentially destroyed. Based on the blood patterns in the snow, now mostly covered but still visible in places, she estimated he'd lived for at least 30 minutes after the attack, possibly longer. Dave Martinez stood between the two bodies, looking from one to the other, trying to reconstruct what had happened. The tracks told most of the story. Daniel and Laura had left the cabin, heading northeast, probably trying to get back to the trailhead. The bear had followed them, stalked them, and eventually attacked. Laura had gone down first, based on her position relative to Daniel's, and Daniel had survived slightly longer, but been unable to help her or himself. The bear had killed them both, then left them, moving off to the west, based on the tracks Dave could still make out in the snow. "We need to get these bodies out of here," he said, "and we need to warn the park that we've got a predatory grizzly active in this area." This wasn't a defensive attack. This was a bear actively hunting people. The team spent the next 2 hours preparing the bodies for transport, a grim and difficult task made worse by the fact that both Daniel and Laura were frozen solid, difficult to move, requiring the team to essentially dig them out of the snow before carefully placing them in body bags. By 9:22 p.m., they had both bodies secured, and Dave made the decision to camp for the night, rather than trying to haul the bodies out in darkness over 11 miles of difficult terrain. They set up tents a quarter-mile from the scene, posted watches through the night in case the bear returned, and tried to rest. The extraction the next morning, December 13th, was slow and painful. The team had to rig sleds to drag the bodies, taking turns with the exhausting work of hauling the sleds through deep snow over steep terrain. A helicopter had been requested, but couldn't land due to continuing weather, so it was all on the ground team. They reached the Two Medicine trailhead at 4:47 p.m., 18 hours after finding the bodies, all of them exhausted and traumatized. Flathead County Medical Examiner's Office took custody of the remains, and the investigation officially began. The news broke on December 14th, and by December 15th, it was national news. "Grizzly kills 2 hikers in Glacier National Park," read the headline in the New York Times. CNN ran a story on December 16th with a headline that said, "Siblings die in rare predatory bear attack in Montana." The story had everything that made for compelling national coverage: young victims, a national park, a predatory grizzly, and the dramatic detail of the bodies being found half a mile apart. News crews descended on Kalispell and Whitefish, interviewing local residents, wildlife experts, and anyone with any connection to the case. Patricia Carter, the siblings' mother, flew into Montana from Seattle on December 15th, accompanied by her brother and sister-in-law. She was 63 years old, still reeling from the loss of her husband 9 months earlier, and now having to deal with the fact that both of her children were dead, killed in the wilderness that her late husband had loved so much. She met with investigators, identified the bodies, and broke down completely when she saw Laura's face, still beautiful even in death, her daughter's expression peaceful in a way that Patricia found almost impossible to reconcile with how she died. The investigation was led by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, working in conjunction with Montana Fish, Wildlife and Parks, the Park Service, and the FBI's Investigative Services Branch. The lead investigator was a U.S. FWS special agent named Robert Yazzie, a Navajo man in his 40s who'd been investigating wildlife crimes and human-wildlife conflicts for over 15 years. He was thorough, methodical, and deeply respectful, treating this not just as a wildlife incident, but as a human tragedy that deserved complete documentation. Agent Yazzie's team returned to the scene on December 16th, when weather finally allowed helicopter access. They documented everything. The cabin where Daniel and Laura had sheltered, the trail they'd tried to hike, the exact locations where each of them had died. They collected hair samples from the site, scat samples that were clearly grizzly bear, and managed to get several good photographs of bear tracks that had been partially preserved in areas where wind had blown snow away from hard-packed surfaces. The tracks confirmed what the rescue team had reported. The bear was a very large male, probably weighing between 500 and 600 pounds based on the track size and stride length. The investigation also documented the destroyed camping gear. Daniel and Laura had been carrying high-end equipment, and the itemized list of destroyed items made for sobering reading. One four-season backpacking tent, manufacturer price $649, 2 down sleeping bags, manufacturer price $489 each, 2 backpacking stoves, 2 water filters, various clothing items, 2 expensive DSLR cameras, 2 smartphones, miscellaneous gear. Total value, approximately $3,127. The bear hadn't eaten any of the gear, just destroyed it, shredding the tent with its claws, biting through the sleeping bags, crushing the stoves. The investigators also found the 2 bear canisters that Daniel and Laura had been using for food storage. Both canisters were intact. Neither one had been opened, meaning the bear had never accessed their food. It had killed them despite having no food reward, which further confirmed the predatory nature of the attack. "This is one of the clearest cases of predatory behavior I've seen," Agent Yazzie told a press conference on December 19th. The bear stalked these victims, followed them when they tried to leave the area, and attacked them despite never receiving any food reward. This was not a defensive situation. The bear was not protecting cubs or a food cache. This was a hungry, desperate bear that had not denned for the winter and saw these hikers as potential prey. The wildlife response was immediate and decisive. Montana Fish, Wildlife and Parks, working with the Park Service, declared the area closed and began efforts to locate and remove the bear. Remove, in this context, meant kill, a decision that sparked immediate controversy. Wildlife advocates argued that the bear was simply being a bear, following its natural instincts, and that humans had entered its territory accepting the risk. Others pointed out that a bear which had killed humans and displayed clear predatory behavior was a public safety threat that couldn't be left in the wild. The decision to kill the bear was ultimately made on December 20th by the Montana Fish, Wildlife and Parks Director, following consultation with wildlife biologists and risk management experts. A team of wildlife specialists was sent into the cut bank drainage with authorization to track and kill any grizzly bear, matching the description of the animal that had killed Daniel and Laura. The team, led by a Montana FWP bear specialist named Thomas Keller, located a large male grizzly on December 23rd, approximately 4 miles from where the attacks had occurred. The bear was feeding on a winter-killed elk when they spotted it from a helicopter, and Thomas made the decision to take the shot. He killed the bear with a single rifle shot from the helicopter, and the carcass was recovered and transported to Montana FWP's Wildlife Health Laboratory in Bozeman for necropsy. The necropsy, performed on December 27th, confirmed that this was almost certainly the bear that had killed Daniel and Laura Carter. DNA analysis of hair samples from the attack site matched DNA from the dead bear with 99.7% certainty. The bear was a male, estimated to be 16 to 18 years old, and weighed 537 pounds, well below the healthy weight for a male grizzly of that age, which should have been closer to 700 pounds. The necropsy found severe dental disease, multiple broken and infected teeth, and significant muscle wasting indicating chronic starvation. The bear also had an old injury to its right front paw, probably from a foothold trap years earlier that had healed poorly and would have affected its ability to hunt normal prey. This bear was in very poor condition, the necropsy report concluded. The combination of dental disease, old injuries, and insufficient fat reserves meant this animal was unable to hunt normal prey species effectively and had not accumulated sufficient fat to den for the winter. The bear was desperate and starving, which likely led to the predatory behavior toward humans. This was a bear in terminal decline that would likely have died within weeks, regardless of human intervention. The findings provided some context but little comfort to Patricia Carter, who told a reporter from the Great Falls Tribune on January 3, 2025, "I understand that the bear was sick and desperate, but that doesn't bring my children back. Daniel and Laura did everything right. They had permits, they had bear spray, they had experience, and they still died. I don't know what to do with that. I don't know how to live with that." The legal aftermath was complex and lengthy. Patricia Carter filed a lawsuit against the National Park Service on February 14, 2025, alleging that the park had failed to adequately warn visitors about the dangers of active grizzly bears in December, failed to close areas where bears were known to be active, and failed to have adequate monitoring systems in place. The lawsuit sought $15 million in damages, citing wrongful death, negligence, and emotional distress. The Park Service responded by arguing that Daniel and Laura had signed standard liability waivers when they obtained their backcountry permits, that the park had adequate signage about bear dangers, and that the siblings had voluntarily chosen to enter a wilderness area during a high-risk time of year. The case dragged through federal court for over a year, generating significant media attention and becoming a flashpoint for debates about wilderness management, personal responsibility, and the challenges of human-wildlife coexistence. Ultimately, in April 2026, the case was settled out of court for an undisclosed amount, believed to be somewhere between $3 million and $5 million, with no admission of liability by the Park Service. Part of the settlement included an agreement that Glacier National Park would install improved signage about winter bear activity, would enhance its monitoring of grizzly denning behavior, and would provide additional training to backcountry rangers about identifying and responding to delayed denning situations. The media coverage of the attacks continued long after the immediate news cycle. In March 2025, Outside Magazine published an extensive feature article titled "When Grizzlies Hunt: The Deaths of Daniel and Laura Carter." The article included interviews with Patricia Carter, with Agent Yazzie, with members of the rescue team, and with several prominent bear biologists. The article explored the broader context of grizzly bear management in the Northern Rockies, the challenges posed by climate change disrupting traditional hibernation patterns, and the fundamental question of what it means to preserve wilderness when that wilderness includes animals that can, under certain circumstances, kill humans. "We want bears to be wild," one biologist told the magazine. We want them to have intact habitat to be able to engage in natural behaviors, but we also want to be safe from them, to be able to hike and camp without fear. Those two things are sometimes incompatible. Daniel and Laura Carter died at that intersection of wilderness and safety, and their deaths raise questions we don't really know how to answer. The psychological impact on everyone involved in the case was profound and lasting. Sarah Chen, the EMT who'd been part of the recovery team, developed symptoms of PTSD after returning from the mission. She had nightmares about finding the bodies, struggled with intrusive thoughts, and eventually took a leave of absence from her work. She sought therapy, was diagnosed with acute stress disorder that later developed into full PTSD, and it took her over a year before she felt capable of returning to search and rescue work. Even then, she told her therapist, she couldn't see snow or hear stories about bear attacks without experiencing intense anxiety and flashbacks. Dave Martinez, the lead ranger on the recovery mission, struggled in different ways. He'd led dozens of rescue operations over his career, had recovered bodies before, but something about this case affected him more deeply than any previous incident. He found himself questioning his career choice, questioning whether it was worth continuing to work in a field where these outcomes were possible. He seriously considered retiring, even drafted a resignation letter, but ultimately decided to stay, channeling his trauma into advocacy for improved wilderness safety education. Jerry Weston, the search and rescue coordinator who'd first received the SOS alert, dealt with survivors' guilt even though he'd had no direct involvement in the attack. He kept thinking about the timeline, kept calculating whether they could have gotten to Daniel and Laura faster, whether different decisions might have changed the outcome. His wife told him repeatedly that he'd done everything possible, that no one could have reached them in time, given the storm and the distance, but the thoughts wouldn't stop circling in his mind. For Patricia Carter, the trauma was all-consuming. She'd lost her husband in March, then both of her children in December, all in the same year. Friends and family worried constantly about her mental state, particularly in the weeks immediately following the deaths when she barely ate, barely slept, and spoke often about not wanting to go on living. Her brother moved into her condo in Seattle, essentially serving as a full-time caretaker for the first 6 months of 2025. Patricia entered intensive therapy, was prescribed antidepressants and anti-anxiety medication, and slowly, incrementally, began to find ways to cope with the grief. One thing that helped was connecting with other parents who'd lost children to wilderness accidents. She found an online support group, started attending meetings, and discovered a community of people who understood her pain in ways that even her closest friends couldn't. She became particularly close with a woman named Jennifer Morrison, whose son had died in a climbing accident in the Tetons in 2019. Jennifer became Patricia's lifeline, the person she could call at 3 a.m. when the grief was overwhelming, the person who understood that grief doesn't follow a timeline or a predictable path. In November 2025, nearly a year after Daniel and Laura's deaths, Patricia decided to return to Montana. She arranged to hike into the Cutbank drainage, accompanied by Jennifer Morrison, Dave Martinez, and Agent Yazzie, all of whom had volunteered to help her. The group hiked in on November 17th, a clear, cold day with about 8 inches of snow on the ground. They made the 11-mile trek to the sites where Daniel and Laura had died, and Patricia spent several hours there, sometimes crying, sometimes silent, sometimes speaking to her children as if they could hear her. She'd brought small memorial markers with her, carved wooden plaques that she and Jennifer had made together, and she placed one at each site. Daniel's marker read, Daniel Robert Carter, 1995 to 2024. He loved these mountains and they took him too soon. Laura's read, Laura Marie Carter, 1998 to 2024. She fought to protect wild places and wild things and gave her life to the wilderness she loved. Dave Martinez helped Patricia dig through the snow to solid ground so the markers could be properly placed, and Agent Yazzie said a blessing in Navajo, honoring the siblings' spirits and asking for peace for their mother. As they were preparing to leave, Patricia asked Dave if he thought the wilderness was worth it, worth the risks, worth the costs. Dave thought for a long time before answering, watching the light fade across the mountains, the same mountains where Daniel and Laura had died. "I don't know," he said finally, and his honesty surprised him. "I've spent my whole life in wild places, and I believe in protecting them, in keeping them wild. But the cost is real, and it's not evenly distributed. Your children paid a price that no one should have to pay, and you're paying a price now that no parent should have to bear. So is it worth it? I want to say yes, but I'm not sure I have the right to make that judgment." Patricia nodded, accepting his answer, and they began the long hike back out. Behind them, the cut-bank drainage settled into evening, the last light touching the peaks, snow beginning to fall again, covering the memorial markers, covering the trails, covering everything in the eternal cycle of the mountains, where beauty and danger are inseparable, where wonder and terror walk hand in hand, where humans venture at their own risk into places that will never truly belong to them. Places that were wild long before we arrived and will remain wild long after we're gone. The deaths of Daniel and Laura Carter became a case study in wildlife management programs, a cautionary tale in wilderness medicine courses, and a point of reference in countless debates about human-wildlife coexistence. Their story was included in a documentary series about national parks that aired on PBS in 2026. It was referenced in congressional hearings about park funding and management in 2027. It appeared in academic papers about bear behavior, about climate change impacts on wildlife, about the psychology of risk in outdoor recreation. But for Patricia Carter, it was never a case study or a data point. It was her son and daughter, her children, her family. She kept their photos on her mantle, kept their hiking gear in her storage unit, unable to throw it away or donate it, unable to let go. She attended a support group meeting every Tuesday evening, and she told their story over and over, not because she wanted to, but because she needed to, because speaking about Daniel and Laura was the only way she had of keeping them present in the world. In therapy sessions, Patricia worked through complex feelings about the bear, about the wilderness, about her late husband's love of the outdoors that had been passed down to their children and ultimately led to their deaths. Some days she felt anger at the bear, at the park service, at the randomness of it all. Other days she felt a strange kind of peace, a sense that Daniel and Laura had died doing what they loved, in a place they found sacred. Most days she felt both things simultaneously, anger and peace coexisting in an uncomfortable tension that she was learning to live with rather than resolve. She also worked through guilt, the persistent feeling that she should have prevented this somehow, should have convinced them not to go, should have insisted they wait for better conditions. Her therapist kept reminding her that Daniel and Laura were adults, that they'd made their own choices, that she wasn't responsible for their deaths. But guilt doesn't respond well to logic, and Patricia continued to carry it, a weight that never entirely lifted. By 2026, Patricia had developed a new routine, a new way of existing in a world without her family. She volunteered at a local wilderness education nonprofit, teaching basic outdoor skills to young people, feeling like this was a way of honoring Daniel and Laura's memory. She created a memorial fund in their names, raising money for wilderness safety research and for organizations that supported families dealing with outdoor recreation accidents. She learned to say their names without crying, though it took over a year before she could do that consistently. The wilderness endured, indifferent to human tragedy, Glacier National Park remained open, visitors continued to come by the millions during the summer months, and the grizzly bear population continued its slow recovery from near extinction, increasing by a few dozen animals each year. The cutbank drainage remained remote and wild, rarely visited, a place where nature followed its own rhythms without regard for human presence or absence. In the spring of 2027, a backpacker named Michael Torres obtained a permit for the same route that Daniel and Laura Carter had attempted. Michael was an experienced wilderness traveler, and he knew the story of what had happened there. He'd read the Outside magazine article, had followed the lawsuit, had studied the case carefully before deciding to attempt the route himself. Some people might have considered it disrespectful or reckless to hike where the Carters had died, but Michael saw it differently. He saw it as an act of witness, a way of acknowledging that the wilderness was still there, still beautiful, still worth experiencing, despite the risks. He hiked in during late May, when snow was melting and temperatures were warmer and bears were awake but fat and healthy from winter denning. He found Laura's memorial marker first, partially damaged by weather, but still legible, and he stopped there for several minutes, reading the inscription, thinking about the young woman who'd died there and about her mother who'd placed the marker. He continued on and found Daniel's marker too, and at both sites he left small stones, a simple gesture of remembrance that required no explanation. Michael completed the route without incident, seeing several elk, a few marmots, and in the distance, miles away, a dark shape that might have been a bear but was too far away to be certain. He finished his trip feeling grateful for the experience and sobered by the awareness of how fine the line was between a beautiful wilderness adventure and a fatal tragedy. The story of Daniel and Laura Carter slowly faded from national consciousness, as all news stories eventually do, replaced by newer tragedies and fresher headlines. But in Montana, in the communities around Glacier National Park, in the wilderness medicine and search and rescue communities, their story remained known, remained relevant, a reminder of the fundamental truth that wilderness is not a theme park, that wild animals are not actors, that nature does not guarantee safety to anyone regardless of experience or preparation. Dave Martinez, who continued working as a ranger at Glacier, thought about Daniel and Laura Carter every single time he issued a backcountry permit to winter campers. He made sure to tell each group about the Carter case, not to frighten them, but to ensure they understood the stakes, understood that the wilderness demanded not just preparation, but also humility, an acceptance that some risks could be mitigated, but never entirely eliminated. Agent Yazzie, who investigated several more bear attacks over the following years, none of them fatal, never forgot the Carter case. It remained his reference point, the investigation he thought of when people asked him about the dangers of grizzly bears or about whether the bears should be more aggressively managed. He gave talks at conferences, showing photos from the investigation, explaining the forensic work that had gone into understanding exactly what happened, always ending with the same conclusion. Wild animals are wild. We can study them. We can try to predict their behavior. We can take precautions, but we can never eliminate the risk entirely. The wilderness is inherently dangerous, and anyone who enters it needs to accept that. Sarah Chen, after her recovery from PTSD, wrote a paper about her experience for a wilderness medicine journal describing the psychological impact of body recovery missions on first responders and offering recommendations for better mental health support in the search and rescue community. The paper was widely cited and led to several search and rescue organizations implementing new protocols for psychological support and debriefing after traumatic missions. By 2030, 6 years after the deaths of Daniel and Laura Carter, their story had taken on an almost mythological quality in the outdoor community. It was the story people told around campfires to reinforce the importance of bear safety. The story that appeared in guidebooks and on warning signs, the cautionary tale that shaped how people thought about winter camping in grizzly country. The details had been smoothed and simplified through countless retellings, losing some accuracy but gaining narrative power, becoming not just a historical event but a parable about hubris and nature and the limits of human control. Patricia Carter, at 69 years old, had learned to live with her grief if not overcome it. She'd published a memoir in 2029 titled Into the Wild and Never Back, a mother's story of loss and survival, which became a regional bestseller and led to her giving talks at bookstores and libraries throughout the Pacific Northwest. In the book, she'd written about her children's lives, about her husband's death, about the terrible December of 2024, and about the long process of learning to continue existing in a world that had taken everyone she'd loved most. The book ended hopefully but honestly, acknowledging that grief never entirely disappears, but can be integrated, can be lived with, can even in some strange way enrich life by making every moment more precious, more aware. She'd also, surprisingly, returned to hiking, not in Montana, not in grizzly country, but on gentle trails in the Cascades near Seattle, usually with Jennifer Morrison or with members of her support group. She'd found that she needed the wilderness, despite what it had taken from her, needed the peace of forests and mountains, needed the sense of connection to something larger than herself. She always carried a photo of Daniel and Laura in her pack, and she always stopped at some point during each hike to take out the photo, to look at their faces, to tell them about what she was seeing. "I think they'd be glad I'm still doing this," she told Jennifer on a hike in October 2030. "I think they'd want me to keep going outside, to not let what happened to them make me afraid of the world." "I think you're right," Jennifer said. "And I think they'd be proud of you, of how you've survived this." Patricia nodded, carefully putting the photo back in her pack, and they continued hiking, two women in their late 60s, both carrying griefs that would never entirely heal, both still finding reasons to put one foot in front of the other, both still capable of noticing beauty, still capable of hope, still alive in a world that had tried very hard to break them, but had ultimately failed. The Cut Bank drainage in Glacier National Park remained wild and indifferent, the site where Daniel and Laura Carter had died gradually returning to its natural state, the memorial markers weathering and eventually disappearing, absorbed back into the landscape. Bears continued to den in caves in the mountains above the drainage, emerging each spring to forage and hunt and live their bear lives, unaware of and unconcerned with the human story that had played out in their territory. The creek continued to flow, freezing in winter and running clear in summer, and the mountains stood eternal and impassive, their peaks catching the first light of morning and the last light of evening. Beautiful and terrible and utterly indifferent to the small human dramas that occasionally unfolded in their shadows. And somewhere in all of that, in the complexity of that landscape and that story, was a truth about wilderness and risk and loss that defied easy summary, that couldn't be reduced to simple lessons about safety or hubris or management policy. Daniel and Laura Carter had died because they loved wild places, because they sought experiences that our increasingly domesticated world rarely offers, because they were willing to accept risk in exchange for wonder. They died because a sick bear had failed to den, because climate change was disrupting ancient patterns, because chance and bad luck and a dozen small decisions had converged in tragedy. They died because wilderness is genuinely wild, genuinely dangerous, genuinely beyond our complete control, and that wildness is both its greatest threat and its greatest value, Their mother lived on, carrying their memory, continuing their love of the outdoors in safer ways, transformed by loss but not destroyed by it. The wilderness lived on, indifferent and magnificent, offering its gifts and its dangers to anyone willing to accept both. And the story lived on, told and retold, changing with each telling, but always maintaining its essential truth, that nature does not guarantee safety, that wild places demand respect, and that sometimes, despite everything we do right, tragedy finds us anyway. The December morning when Daniel and Laura Carter woke in their rental cabin in Whitefish, excited and prepared for their wilderness pilgrimage, was full of possibility and promise. The December evening when their bodies were found, frozen in the snow 11 miles from safety, was full of grief and unanswered questions. Between those two moments lay a story of love and loss, of risk and consequence, of the eternal dance between humans and wilderness that has been playing out for thousands of years and will continue playing out for thousands more, as long as there are wild places left and people brave enough or foolish enough or simply human enough to venture into them.